Hello everyone. I know you use this video to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Every night, I had a simple routine before bed. I'd walk through each room of my house, making sure every door was securely locked. It was a habit born from a need to feel safe, to ensure that the outside world stayed just that outside. This routine brought me comfort, a quiet assurance, as I settled down to sleep each night. One morning, however, I woke up to find the back door not just unlocked, but wide open. A rush of cold morning air greeted me as I walked into the kitchen. Confusion and a tinge of fear swirled through me. I could have sworn I locked it the night before, just like I always did. Shaking off the unease, I chalked it up to a simple mistake. Perhaps I was more tired than I realized and forgot to check it. The incident unsettled me, but by evening, I had pushed it from my mind. I double-checked the locks that night, making extra sure that the back door was secure. But the next morning, the same chilling scene met my eyes. The door was wide open again. This time, there was no dismissing it as a mere oversight. A growing sense of dread took hold of me. Someone was entering my house at night. With no signs of forced entry, I wondered how this could be happening. The locks were intact, the windows secure. It felt as though someone had a key, but that was impossible. Only I had the keys. My mind raced with terrifying thoughts. Was someone watching me, waiting for me to fall asleep to invade my private space? I couldn't stand the thought of being so vulnerable, of an unseen intruder observing me in my most intimate moments. Determined to catch whoever it was, I set up a camera in the kitchen, aimed directly at the back door. If someone was coming into my house, I'd have evidence. That night, I went to bed with a knot in my stomach, the camera my only solace. The footage from that night revealed nothing. The door remained closed, just as I had left it. Relief washed over me in the morning when I reviewed the tape. Maybe, I thought, the stress was getting to me, making me imagine things. But as I turned off the camera, a cold breeze hit me. The back door was open, yet the camera showed it had never been unlocked during the night. Panic set in as I realized the implications. The door was being opened from the inside. Was someone hiding in my house? The thought was unbearable. I searched every inch of the house, every possible hiding spot I could think of, but found nothing. No one was there, no sign of another living soul. That day, I changed all the locks and installed additional security cameras, both inside and out. The next night, the cameras were armed, the new locks engaged. Morning came, and with it the now familiar rush of cold air from an open back door. The footage showed nothing, no movement, no signs of entry. Yet there it was, wide open as if to mock my efforts. Driven by desperation, I contacted a local security expert who suggested an explanation that chilled me to the bone. He proposed that perhaps the phenomenon wasn't an intruder at all, but something less explainable, less rational. Could it be that my home was host to something otherworldly? The thought was ludicrous, something out of a horror story. But what else could explain the doors that refused to stay locked, the cameras that showed nothing? As the days turned into weeks with no change, my sleep grew restless, filled with vivid dreams where shadowy figures whispered just beyond hearing. I started researching, diving into local history and folklore, desperate for any clue that might explain my nightly visitors. Stories of old forgotten spirits and unexplained phenomena in the area began to surface. Each tale spun a thread of the paranormal, weaving a tapestry of ghostly legends that seemed to dance eerily close to the reality I was experiencing. This pursuit of knowledge was both a curse and a solace, providing context but no solution, leaving me to ponder the thin veil between our world and the one that might lurk just out of sight. Now, every night, I locked the doors knowing they might not stay that way. I've tried to come to terms with the inexplicable nature of my situation. Perhaps some things aren't meant to be understood. The cold breeze in the morning no longer scares me as it once did. Instead, I greet it with a resigned nod, a silent acknowledgement of the mysterious presence that shares my home. And every morning, as I close the back door, I wonder about the unseen forces that roam the world, just on the other side of the wood and glass. I've always loved being alone, which is why the small cabin deep in the woods seemed perfect when I found it online. It promised peace, quiet, and no neighbours for miles. Perfect for someone like me who enjoys nature more than people. The realtor called it a rustic retreat, but to me it was my new safe place. A spot to start over and maybe find parts of myself I'd lost in the city's noise. The first few weeks were wonderful. I took long walks through the dense forest, listened to the birds, and at night the skies were so clear I felt like I could see every star. It was during one of these starry nights that I first felt it, a weird tingling on the back of my neck, as if someone was watching me. I told myself I was alone out here, completely alone. But the feeling didn't go away. It got stronger each day. Strange things started happening. A rustle just outside my sight, things not where I left them, and shadows that seemed too sticky. Then came the dreams, vivid and disturbing, featuring someone who looked just like me, copying my every move but with a scary twist in their smile. One cold evening, as I made the fire stronger, I decided I had enough. I needed to face whatever was bothering me. Was it all in my head? The stress of moving? Or something real? I wasn't sure, but I was determined to find out. That night, I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat in the living room, the only light from the fading fire. Hours went by, each moment longer than the last. Just as I started to nod off, a slight noise snapped me alert. A soft sigh from the hallway. My heart pounding, I looked towards the sound. There, in the dim light, stood someone so like me that I thought I was looking in a mirror. But the cold, mean look in their eyes was not like mine at all. "Why are you here?" I barely got the words out, my voice quiet. The figure, my double, moved closer, without making a sound. "I am you," it said, its voice an empty echo of mine, or what you could have been. "I am here to take the life you've wasted." I froze, watching it come closer. It looked just like me, but those eyes were full of a coldness that wasn't human. "This isn't real," I stuttered, trying to convince myself more than it. "You're just a trick of my mind." "Am I?" It taunted, a smirk on its lips. "Or am I the part of you that you've always been scared to face?" I realized then this wasn't just a mind game. It was a battle for my soul. I gathered my courage, standing to face it fully. "I'm not scared of you," I said, my voice shaking. It laughed, a sound that made my skin crawl. "You should be." It charged at me. I dodged, just missing its grip, and ran for the kitchen. I grabbed a knife, turning just in time to see it coming at me again. What followed was a blur, a fierce fight. I used all my strength, driven by a deep need to live. Finally, after what felt like forever, I managed to hit it. The knife went into its chest, and the double screamed, a sound not of this world. As it fell, it faded away like mist, leaving no sign it was ever there. Breathing hard, I fell to the floor, the knife next to me. The danger was gone, but the fear it left was deep. Haunted by that night, I often think back, each time feeling a new layer of fear. The feeling of being watched never really went away. It hides in the silent moments, whispering to me in the seconds before I fall asleep, saying it's still out there waiting. Are there more like it? Versions of myself, not stuck in that cabin, but wandering, waiting for their chance. I left the next day, unable to face the night's terrors any longer. The cabin still stands, quiet in the woods. Sometimes I wonder if it was all just my fear playing tricks. But then I remember how cold it felt, the hate in its eyes, and I know it was real. Now, I watch over my shoulder, always careful of the shadows, especially those that look just like me. It was late on a Friday night when I finally settled down on my couch after a long week. The wind was howling outside, a typical autumn gust that rattled the windows and sent leaves swirling. That's when my phone vibrated with a notification from my Ring camera. Motion detected at front door. Curious, I tapped the notification, expecting maybe a fallen branch or a roaming animal caught on the lens. The live feed loaded, showing my front porch bathed in the dim glow of the porch light. At first, I saw nothing out of the ordinary, just the whipping trees and leaves in the wind. But then I noticed something unusual, a figure, seemingly cloaked, standing at the far edge of the camera's view. It wasn't moving, just standing there, facing the camera. I leaned closer to my phone, trying to make out more details, but the figure was shrouded in darkness, and the low quality of the night vision made it difficult. The figure then took a slow, deliberate step toward the camera. As it moved into better light, I could see it more clearly. A face, or rather, what should have been a face. Where features should be, there was nothing but a smooth, blank surface, like a mannequin. Alarm bells went off in my head, and a chill ran down my spine. I immediately called the local police station, my eyes never leaving the screen. As I explained what I was seeing, the figure stopped moving and stood still again, as if it knew I was calling for help. The dispatcher assured me that someone would be out shortly to check on the situation. I thanked them and hung up, my gaze returning to the phone. The figure was closer now, almost at the door. It raised its head, and I swear, it looked like it was looking right into the camera, right at me. Its head cocked to the side, curiously, unnervingly. Just then, the doorbell rang. My heart nearly stopped. I stared at the phone, then at the door, frozen in fear. The camera feed was still live, showing the figure now standing directly in front of the camera. With shaking hands, I moved to the door, peering through the peephole. There was nothing there. No one. I turned back to my phone, and the figure was gone from the feed as well. Confused and terrified, I opened the door a crack, the cold wind blasting into the house. I looked around, but saw nothing, no sign of anyone or anything unusual. The street was empty, the night unusually silent except for the wind. The police arrived minutes later, finding me standing at the open door, phone in hand, pale and confused. They did a thorough check around the property, but found nothing amiss. No signs of entry, no footprints, nothing out of place except my frayed nerves. After they left, I tried to settle back down, but every creak and moan of the house had me jumpy. I couldn't shake the image of that blank, featureless face from my mind. Sleep was impossible. The night stretched on endlessly, every sound a reminder of that face at my door. Days passed, and nothing more happened. No more figures on the camera, no more unexplained doorbell rings. But the damage was done. Every time my phone buzzed with a notification from the Ring camera, my heart skipped. I couldn't look at the feed without a deep sense of dread. One evening, as I tried to unwind with a book, My mind kept wandering back to that night. The silence of my home, usually a comforting blanket, now felt oppressive, as if it were holding its breath along with me. I checked my phone compulsively, the Ring app always open, displaying the live feed of the front porch. Each shadow cast by the swaying branches made me tense, each rustle of leaves a potential harbinger of that faceless visitor's return. As the days turned into weeks, my friends began to notice a change in me. I was jumpy, easily startled, and had bags under my eyes from countless sleepless nights. Invitations to social events were declined. I just couldn't bring myself to leave the house after sunset. My home, once a sanctuary, now felt like a trap, keeping me in constant view of the lens of the Ring camera, which had captured so much more than I'd ever wanted. Trying to reclaim some sense of normalcy, I decided to cover the camera lens. Maybe if I didn't see the porch, I could convince myself that nothing was there. That night, with the camera covered, I managed to fall asleep earlier than I had in weeks. But the relief was short-lived. At exactly 3:07 a.m., I was awoken by the sound of the doorbell ringing. I froze, a cold sweat breaking out. The doorbell rang again, persistent. I grabbed my phone. No notifications, no motion detected. The camera was still covered, blind to whatever was outside my door. It all began on a night wrapped in silence, so calm it was almost felt unreal. The kind was sitting at my desk, the glow of my laptop barely lighting the room, working on a manuscript that was stubbornly refusing to be finished. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of movement outside the window, a fleeting shadow under the street lamp. I glanced up, expecting to see a neighborhood cat slinking by, but there was nothing. I shrugged it off and went back to my writing, but a nagging unease settled in my mind. Over the next few nights, the shadow returned, each time arriving a bit earlier and staying a bit longer. It soon became clear that this was no stray animal. It was the outline of a person, standing just beyond the reach of the light, perfectly still and silent. Each time I dared to look, it seemed as though the figure had edged closer to the window, its features swallowed by the darkness. I tried to rationalize it, perhaps a curious neighbor, but the comforting blanket of logic did little to stifle the growing dread that crept into my evenings. I decided it was time to confront whatever or whoever it was. Armed with a flashlight, I approached the window one particularly dark evening. My hand trembled as I aimed the beam of light at the figure, but as the light pierced the darkness, there was nothing there, just the empty night and the rustling of the wind through the trees. That night, sleep eluded me. The image of the empty window haunted my thoughts. When sleep finally came, it was fitful and brief. I awoke suddenly to the sound of tapping against the glass. Tap, 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 a slow, deliberate rhythm that chilled my blood. Heart beating, I sat up and looked toward the window. There, illuminated by the moonlight, was the figure, clearer now. It was a man, his face pale and eyes hollow, staring directly at me. Our eyes locked, and in his gaze I sensed a profound sadness and despair. The next morning, I was exhausted and on edge. The encounter had shaken me deeply. I decided to seek help. The local police were sympathetic, but found no evidence of anyone lurking outside my house. No footprints, no signs of any disturbance. They suggested I keep the windows locked and consider installing security cameras. Practical advice, yet it did little to calm my fears. As the days passed, the visits became more frequent. Every night, as soon as the sun set, he appeared, always in the same spot, always with that same mournful expression. Driven by a need for answers, I began to research the history of my home and uncovered a chilling fact. Years ago, It had been the site of a tragic event. A man had taken his own life, right outside that very window. This knowledge did not bring comfort, rather, it filled me with a dreadful understanding. Desperate for any form of resolution, I reached out to a medium, a small, elderly woman with a gentle demeanour who came recommended by a friend. She agreed to come to my home to see if she could communicate with the apparition. That night, we sat together in the dim light of the living room, the medium's voice a soothing whisper. She spoke to the man, asking him what he desired. The air grew colder, the atmosphere heavy, as though his sorrow had permeated the very walls of the room. "He's lost," the medium finally said, her eyes brimming with sadness. "He doesn't realize that he's passed on. He thinks he's still part of this world, and he's incredibly lonely." She explained that the man needed guidance toward the light, to be reassured that it was okay to move on. Following her lead, I spoke to him, my voice steady despite the trembling inside. I told him that he didn't have to remain here, that he could find peace. The following night, I waited by the window, the medium's words echoing in my heart. The street lamp outside cast a weak glow, and then there he was. I approached the window, my resolve stronger now. "You can leave," I said kindly. "It's okay. You can go to the light." Gradually, the sadness in his eyes seemed to diminish, replaced by a look of relief. He nodded slightly, and as I watched, he faded away, disappearing into the night air. After that night, he never returned. The night my car broke down was one I'll never forget. I was driving home late after visiting a friend in another town. The road was mostly empty, the kind of road where you can drive for miles without seeing another soul. Everything was fine until my car suddenly made a strange noise and started to slow down. I managed to pull over, but there I was, stuck on the side of a dark, lonely road. I checked my phone. Thankfully, I had a signal, so I quickly called for a tow truck. They said it would take about an hour for them to get to me. I sat back in my car, trying not to worry, and turned on the radio to pass the time. As I listened to some music, I glanced out the window and saw something in the dark, just beyond the reach of my headlights. There was a figure standing by the roadside. At first, I thought it might be someone else who had car trouble, or maybe just a pedestrian, which was odd at this late hour. But the figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring in my direction. I couldn't make out any features. It was just a shadowy outline of a person. Curious and a bit unsettled, I rolled down my window a bit and called out, asking if they needed help. There was no response. The figure remained motionless, just watching. A chill ran down my spine, and I quickly rolled the window back up. I tried to focus on anything else, telling myself it was just someone odd, or maybe my mind playing tricks on me. But no matter how hard I tried to distract myself, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept peeking out the window, and each time, the figure was still there, standing in the same spot. The radio suddenly lost reception, filling the car with static noise. I turned it off, the silence of the night pressing in. Every sound seemed amplified, the wind rustling through the trees, the distant call of a night animal, and my own heartbeat thumping loudly in my chest. Then I heard a faint tapping. I froze, listening intently. It came again, tap, 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 on the passenger side window. I turned slowly, heart pounding, half expecting to see the figure right next to me. But there was nothing there, just the reflection of the moon on the glass. The wait for the tow truck felt like an eternity. Every minute was stretched by the heavy air of unease. When I finally saw the headlights of the tow truck in the distance, relief washed over me. I started the car, and the headlights flickered on, briefly illuminating the area where the figure had been standing. It was empty now. There was no sign of anyone having been there. The tow truck driver was friendly and efficient, getting my car hooked up quickly. I didn't mention the figure to him. I didn't want to sound foolish. As we drove off, I looked back at the stretch of road, half expecting to see the figure reappear, but there was nothing. As the tow truck pulled away, the uneasy silence of the night returned. The relief of leaving that spot was tinged with a deep, lingering curiosity about the mysterious figure. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it simply a trick of the light, or perhaps someone in distress who couldn't find the words to ask for help? These thoughts spun around, unsettling me further as we moved farther from where my car had broken down. I kept replaying the scene over and over, wondering if there was something I could have done differently to understand the situation better. The ride back to town was quiet, the only sounds being the hum of the tow truck and the occasional crackle of the driver's radio. Despite the conversation attempts by the driver, my attention kept drifting back to the empty road behind us. The image of the figure, so distinctly outlined yet entirely featureless, had etched itself in my mind. What was most disturbing was how the presence felt so menacing without ever moving or speaking, a silent watcher in the night, whose intentions remained shrouded in mystery. That night left me with so many questions. Who was the figure? What did they want? Why were they watching me? The memory of those motionless, watching eyes lingered with me long after. Even now, when I drive at night and pass a quiet stretch of road, I find myself glancing to the side, half expecting to see a figure standing in the darkness, watching. One night, I woke up suddenly. It was very quiet, and the only light came from the moon shining through my window. I felt a chill and sat up in bed to see what might have woken me. That's when I saw it. It was a dark shape at the end of my bed. It was a shadow, taller than any normal person, just standing there quietly. At first, I thought I was still dreaming. I blinked a few times, hoping the shadow would disappear. But it didn't. It was definitely there, and very real. My heart started to beat faster, and I slowly reached out towards my lamp. My hand was shaking a bit as I touched the switch. When the light flicked on, the shadow moved. It didn't run or walk. It sort of just slid into the darker part of my room, where the light couldn't reach. After that, I couldn't sleep. I turned on all the lights and just sat there, watching the dark corners of my room. Hours passed like this. The shadow didn't come back, but the fear stayed with me. I kept imagining it just outside the light, waiting. The next day, I was very tired, but too scared to sleep. Nighttime made me nervous now. I tried to convince myself that what I saw was just my imagination, maybe a trick of the light or a dream that felt too real. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. It felt different, more real than any dream I've ever had. I decided I needed to do something. I went out and bought more lights for my room. I got lamps and bright bulbs and set them up all around. I thought that if the room was brighter, the shadow wouldn't be able to hide anywhere. That night, with my room lit up like the middle of the day, I tried to sleep again. It was hard, but eventually I fell asleep. I slept well for a few nights. No shadows appeared, and I started to feel a little better. Maybe it had been nothing after all. Maybe the light was enough to keep whatever it was away. But then it happened again. It was a week later, another quiet night. I woke up suddenly feeling cold. My room was bright, all the lights still on, but there, by the closet, the shadow stood again. This time it was closer, and it seemed darker, almost solid. I stared at it, frozen with fear. The shadow just stood there, not moving, not making a sound. Then slowly it began to move towards me. I jumped out of bed and turned on even more lights, but it didn't disappear this time. It stayed, fading just a bit, but still there. I didn't know what to do. It seemed like nothing could stop it. Not the lights, not my fear, nothing. Desperate, I left my house that night. I drove to a friend's place and stayed there, telling them everything. They listened and didn't say it was just my imagination. They believed me, and that felt good, to not be alone with it anymore. Together, we went back to my house the next day. We entered my room cautiously, turning on all the lights. The shadow was gone, but the fear wasn't. We decided to stay up that night, watching together. Nothing appeared, but we could both feel something was off. The air felt thicker, and every so often, a cold draft would pass through the room. That experience changed me. I couldn't live in that room anymore, knowing what I'd seen. I moved out not long after. Even now, in my new place, I keep the lights on every night. I don't know if the shadow followed me, or if it's waiting for me to turn off the lights again. But I'm not taking any chances. As days turned into weeks and then into months, the incident continued to influence every aspect of my life. My days were consumed by research into paranormal phenomena, desperate for anything that might explain or relate to what I had experienced. At night, my dreams replayed the event, each time with slight variations that made me question my reality even more. Conversations with friends began to drift into awkward silences whenever I tried to share my fears or seek their advice. It was as if the shadow wasn't just haunting my nights, but had started to darken my days as well, pushing me further into isolation as I struggled to cope with the unseen presence that might still be lurking near. Every night now, I think about that shadow at the foot of my bed. What was it? Why did it come to me? These questions haunt me, and I'm not sure I'll ever find the answers. But I know what I saw, and I can't forget it. Sometimes I wonder if it'll ever come back, if it'll ever move out of the darkness and reveal what it really wants from me. Until then, all I can do is keep the lights on and wait. Every evening, as the sky softened to dusk, I would leash up my dog, Max, and we'd step out into the fresh air for our nightly walk. This was our time to relax and stretch after a day inside. Our path was always the same, meandering through the quiet streets of our neighborhood. Over time, I began to notice a consistent figure. A woman always walked on the opposite side of the street. She was alone, similar to me, minus a pet. Her attire was striking, long, flowing dresses that seemed too grand for casual walks, and her hair was always neatly styled up, without a hair out of place. Despite seeing her repeatedly, she never looked up or acknowledged my presence. She seemed lost in her own world, moving like a shadow bound to an invisible track. Initially, her presence was simply intriguing, a quiet enigma wrapped in solitude. But as the weeks passed, her constant, unchanged path and her disregard for my presence started to unsettle me. Why was she always there at the exact time, never interacting? One crisp evening, as the first whispers of autumn rustled the leaves, Max and I set out as usual. There she was again, her form faintly glowing in the street lamp's light. Approaching a stretch of shops with large windows, I caught sight of our reflections. There was Max, tail wagging, and there was I bundled against the chill. But shockingly, her reflection was right beside me on my side of the street. My heart raced. In the reflection, she moved in sync with me, a silent figure mirroring my steps. I spun around, expecting to find her beside me, but she was not there. She was still across the street, her head down, continuing forward as if nothing had happened. Confused and slightly scared, I quickly walked home, Max matching my hurried pace. Once safe inside, I locked the door and looked out the window. The street was now empty. The woman had disappeared, as if she had melted into the night. The following evening, I was hesitant as the time for our walk drew near. Driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, I decided to follow the same route, hoping to understand the mystery of the woman or her reflection. As we neared the shop windows where I'd seen the uncanny reflection, my grip tightened on Max's leash. She appeared again, on the other side as always, aloof and detached. I approached the window slowly, my heart filled with a mix of dread and anticipation. Again, the reflection showed her next to me, so close I almost felt the imaginary brush of her dress. I turned quickly, my heart thumping, but once more, she was not beside me. She was still across the street, now blending into the twilight. This time, I didn't run. I stood there confused, watching the space where she vanished. How could she appear so near, yet remain so far? As this strange occurrence repeated night after night, I began to delve into local history, searching for any clue who this woman might be or any event linked to the street. The chilling truth emerged from old newspaper archives. Many years ago, a woman was tragically lost in a hit-and-run accident right on this street. The description matched her perfectly: the elegant dresses, the neat bun. Her name was Mrs. Eleanor Rigby, once a beloved local teacher known for her evening strolls. Haunted by the discovery, my evening walks took on a new dimension. I could no longer view the quiet streets the same way. They were now veiled in the melancholy of Mrs. Rigby's unresolved past. The knowledge that she had walked these paths, perhaps even enjoyed these same sights and sounds before her untimely departure, brought a somber reverence to what had once been a mundane activity. Each shadow and flicker of movement in the periphery of my vision made me wonder about the stories hidden in plain sight, the histories we passed by every day without a second thought. This awareness brought a deeper, albeit eerie, appreciation for the small world of our neighbourhood. Now I understood. Her spirit lingered, retracing steps she'd walked in life, unable to leave the place she once loved. In the reflections of the shop windows, where realities might blur, she found a semblance of companionship. One evening, as the sky painted itself into the deep blues of night, my phone notified me consistently with messages from Lara, my close friend since college. She was excited about coming over to catch up, promising she'd be at my place soon. As hours ticked by, her messages kept arriving, each assuring she was just a bit delayed, but definitely on her way. As midnight approached without any sign of her, I began to worry. It wasn't like Lara to be so unreliable, especially without a valid reason. Each message seemed a bit off too, not quite in her usual tone. The words were hers, but felt strangely assembled, as if someone else was piecing them together. By the time I finally drifted to sleep, Lara had not shown up, and my unease had grown into a tight knot of anxiety. The next morning brought more confusion. I awoke to a message from Lara's number sent in the early hours. "I'm sorry I couldn't make it. There's been an accident. I was in the hospital the past few days." This alarming text contradicted all her messages from the night before. Concerned, I tried calling her, but the calls went straight to voicemail. The unease I felt the night before turned into genuine alarm. I decided to go to her house. Upon arriving, I found everything eerily quiet. Knocking produced no answer, and a neighbour, noticing my persistent attempts, came out to inform me that he hadn't seen Lara in several days. He mentioned seeing her leave in a hurry one evening, looking distressed, and she hadn't returned since. No one had heard from her, no one knew where she was, and the information about her supposed accident only deepened the mystery. The next step was reaching out to the local hospitals, but none had any record of Lara being admitted recently. My calls to our mutual friends revealed they too had received texts from her about being delayed due to various reasons over the last few nights. No one had actually seen her. It was as if she had vanished, leaving behind nothing but a string of text messages. The police became involved, treating Lara's sudden disappearance seriously. They too began to trace her last known activities, her phone's last location, and attempted to dig into the source of the messages. The investigation revealed that her phone had been active miles away from her supposed route to my house, in a completely different direction from both our homes and any hospital. As days turned into weeks with no word from Lara, the text messages stopped. The last one was about the accident, and after that, her phone went dark. It was as if she had disappeared off the face of the earth, with her last communications being those uncharacteristic messages. The mystery of her disappearance began to take its toll on me and our circle of friends, each of us grappling with the uncertainty and the sinister possibilities of what might have happened to her. I began to look back over our messages, searching for any clue I might have missed, any sign of where she could have gone, or what might have truly happened that night she vanished. The messages seemed to taunt me with their normalcy, a stark contrast to the dire situation. Each word seemed carefully chosen to not alarm, yet in their context, they screamed of something wrong. As the investigation continued without any leads, I couldn't help but feel watched. Occasionally, I'd receive messages from unknown numbers with snippets that sounded like they could have come from Lara, but they were disjointed, making little sense. Each message would disappear from my phone shortly after being read, leaving me to question my sanity. Months later, with no further developments, the intensity of the situation began to wane, but the shadow of Lara's disappearance never fully receded. The impact of her vanishing so mysteriously lingered in my thoughts, a constant reminder of the fragility of our connections, and the ease with which someone could seemingly erase their existence. In my heart, I held on to the hope that wherever Lara was, she was safe, perhaps starting anew somewhere far away from the troubles that had haunted her here. Yet, in the quiet moments of solitude, I often found myself gazing at my phone, half expecting a message from her, a sign that this was all just a terrible misunderstanding. But as each day passed, the silence grew heavier, a stark testament to the void her absence had left in my life. The night was unusually cold as I waited for the last bus to take me home. The bus stop was empty except for the dull hum of the streetlights and the distant sounds of the city winding down. When the bus finally arrived, it was nearly empty, which was a relief after a long, exhausting day. I climbed aboard, greeted the driver with a tired nod, and took a seat near the front. I took a look towards the back and noticed one other passenger, a man sitting alone, his face partially obscured by the dim light overhead. He was dressed in nondescript clothing, and I didn't think much of him at first. I settled into my seat, pulling out my phone to catch up on messages as the bus rumbled along its route. As we neared my stop, a subtle anxiety began to creep in. I pressed the button to signal my stop, and as I stood to get off, I noticed in the window's reflection that the man at the back stood as well. A coincidence, I thought. Maybe this was his stop too. I stepped off the bus, the cool night air making me shiver. The bus pulled away, its lights fading into the night, and I started my walk home along the familiar, poorly lit streets. That's when I heard it, the sound of footsteps behind me. I looked back and saw the man from the bus following at a distance. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Perhaps he was just going in the same direction. But as I quickened my pace, did he? His footsteps kept time with mine, a steady echo in the quiet street. My heart started to race, and every scenario I had ever imagined about being followed played out in my mind. Trying to stay calm, I turned onto a busier street, hoping the presence of more people would deter him from following. But it was late, and the street was deserted. His footsteps never faltered, always there just behind me. I dared another glance back. He was closer now, and though I couldn't make out his face clearly, I could feel his eyes on me. Panic setting in, I turned down my street, which was lined with familiar houses, all dark inside as my neighbours had likely gone to bed. I quickened my pace even more, nearly running now, and so did he. His footsteps grew louder, more urgent. I fumbled for my phone, thinking to call someone, anyone, but my trembling fingers dropped it. As I bent to pick it up, I braced myself for him to catch up, for something terrible, but nothing happened. I grabbed my phone, stood up quickly, and looked around. He was gone, vanished as if he had never been there. I spun around, scanning the empty street, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. There was no sign of him, no footsteps fading into the distance, just silence. Shaken, I hurried home, locking the door behind me and leaning against it, trying to catch my breath. The house felt empty, too quiet. Every small sound made me jump. Every shadow in the corner of my vision seemed to move. I couldn't sleep that night or many nights after. The memory of being followed, the fear, and the relief all mixed together into a nightmare that replayed every time I closed my eyes. I started taking taxis at night instead of the bus, avoiding the uncertainty and fear that night had instilled in me. Months passed, and the fear gradually subsided, but the incident left its mark. I became more cautious, more aware of my surroundings when I was out. I shared my experience with friends and family, and while some offered advice, others shared similar stories that made me realize I wasn't alone in my experience. One day, while talking with a neighbor about that night, they mentioned seeing a man fitting the description of my follower on several occasions around the neighborhood late at night. They said he seemed out of place, always looking around as if lost or searching for something or someone. This information sent a chill down my spine, reigniting the old fears. I reported what I had learned to the local police, who took down the information and promised to increase patrols in the area at night. Whether they ever found him, I don't know, but since that night on the bus, I never saw him again. Even now, I can't help but look over my shoulder when walking along at night, listening for footsteps, half expecting to see the stranger from the bus behind me. During a long-awaited solo road trip, I found myself driving through a stretch of road flanked by dense forests as the sun began to set. Realizing it would be unwise to drive through the night, I decided to find a place to stay. The options were limited, so when I saw a sign for a small motel off the next exit, I took it. The motel was more rundown than I had hoped, with a flickering neon sign and a gravel parking lot that crunched under my tires. The lobby was dimly lit and carried a musty smell, but the wariness from my day's travel weighed heavier on me than my reservations about the place. I checked in at the front desk, where an elderly man with a weary smile handed me the key to room number 8. He warned me that the TV was a bit finicky, but assured me everything was clean and in working order. As I unlocked the door to my room, a creak echoed through the still night, setting the tone for what was inside. The room was shabbily furnished with a bed that had seen better days, a rickety chair, and a small old-fashioned TV set perched on a dresser. The carpet was patterned with stains that could tell stories of countless travellers before me, and there was a peculiar smell, a mix of dampness and something I couldn't quite place. Despite the room's uninviting appearance, I was too tired to consider driving to another motel. I dropped my bag, decided to take a quick shower, and then settled in for the night. However, as I tried to relax, the room's atmosphere started to unsettle me. The TV flickered to life suddenly, startling me as I sat on the bed. I stood up and turned it off, chalking it up to the faulty wiring the man at the desk had mentioned. Trying to ignore the room's oddities, I eventually drifted off to sleep. But it wasn't a restful sleep. It was fitful, filled with strange half-dreams. Suddenly, in the depth of the night, I awoke to a sound that sent a chill down my spine, heavy breathing. It was loud and ragged, as if someone was standing right beside the bed. I snapped on the bedside lamp, and the room was instantly awash in dull yellow light. Heart pounding, I scanned the room. I was alone. The breathing had stopped, the only sound now the quiet hum of the motel's aging electrical system. Yet the air felt thick, as if charged with unspoken words. Unable to sleep any further, I sat up for the rest of the night, the TV remote clutched tightly in my hand as a makeshift sense of security. The TV remained off, but the unsettling feeling did not leave me. Every shadow seemed to move just in the corner of my vision, and the strange smell grew stronger, more oppressive. As dawn broke, I packed my things quickly, eager to leave the creepy motel room behind. At checkout, I mentioned the TV and the heavy breathing to the man at the desk. He simply nodded, his expression unreadable. "Room number 8 has its quirks," was all he said, an explanation that explained nothing. As miles stretched under the relentless hum of my car's engine, I found my thoughts drifting back to the heavy breathing that had shattered the night's silence. It was a sound so vivid and disturbing that it seemed impossible to dismiss as mere figment of sleep-deprived anxiety. What's more, the old man's cryptic acknowledgement of the room's quirks suggested that my experience wasn't unique, adding a layer of intrigue and dread to the motel's shabby walls and dimly lit corridors. Even as I welcomed the morning's light and the normalcy of the highway, part of me wondered if I had narrowly escaped something truly sinister, or if the road I was on might one day lead me back through that motel's unwelcoming doors in search of answers. Once back in my car, I felt a sense of relief wash over me as I drove away from the motel. The experience left me with a lingering unease, a reminder that sometimes the places we stop to rest are merely pauses in more significant journeys, filled with their own stories and secrets. The road ahead seemed brighter as I left the motel behind, but the memory of that night stayed with me, a spooky chapter in my road trip adventure that I would not soon forget. When the moving truck pulled up next door, I watched with casual interest from behind my kitchen window. The neighborhood hadn't seen new residents in a while, and the arrival of a family was enough to stir a bit of curiosity. They seemed like a typical family, the parents unloading boxes, kids running around exploring their new yard. I thought about going over to introduce myself, but life got busy, and the opportunity slipped away. A few weeks after they had settled in, there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find the mother from next door, her expression tight, and her hands wringing nervously. She introduced herself as Angela. Without much preamble, she leaned in slightly, her voice a low whisper. "Keep your doors locked at night," she said, "and whatever you do, if you hear something in the yard, don't look outside." Her words caught me off guard. I chuckled, half expecting her to laugh and reveal it as a neighborhood inside joke. But her face remained serious, eyes darting around as if afraid of being overheard. Not wanting to pry into what I assumed were personal superstitions, I nodded, assuring her I'd keep that in mind. The warning, odd as it was, didn't stick with me. Nights passed without incident, and the small noises of a house settling or the distant sounds of nightlife didn't concern me. That was until one night, a scraping sound echoed outside my bedroom window. It wasn't the usual rustle of wind-blown leaves or the scurry of nocturnal animals. It was deliberate, like something or someone was dragging something heavy across the yard. Curiosity overcame Angela's warning, and I found myself tiptoeing to the window, compelled to see the source of the noise. As I peeked through the blinds, the yard was bathed in the pale light of the moon, casting long shadows that twisted and distorted with every passing cloud. The noise stopped abruptly, and I scanned the area, my heartbeat quickening with a mix of fear and anticipation. Nothing moved, and just as I was about to turn away, dismissing it as my imagination, I saw it. A shadow detached itself from the darker part of the yard, standing upright like a person. It was too far and too dark to see details, but the silhouette was unmistakably human-like, and it was facing my direction. I snapped the blinds shut and stumbled back, heart pounding in my chest. Angela's words replayed in my mind, a warning I had foolishly ignored. I spent the rest of the night away from the window, listening to the unsettling sounds of something moving around outside. The next morning I went outside, half expecting to find evidence of a nighttime visitor, but there was nothing, no footprints, no signs of disturbance. Everything was exactly as I had left it, which somehow made the whole experience more unnerving. Over the next few nights, the sounds continued. Sometimes it was just a soft rustling, other times that same deliberate scraping. I kept my curiosity in check, heeding Angela's advice not to look. The atmosphere in the neighborhood changed for me. The shadows seemed darker, every noise sharper. I finally gathered the nerve to visit Angela, hoping for an explanation. She opened the door, her face drawn and tired. Seeing my anxious expression, she sighed and invited me in. Over a cup of coffee, she shared her story. They had moved from a town where they'd experienced unexplainable occurrences, sounds, shadows, and an unsettling feeling of being watched. She had hoped those things would end with their move. Her warning was her way of protecting me from whatever had followed them, or perhaps what had always been here waiting. Now, as I sit in my home, especially during the quiet of night, I wonder about the unseen. The family next door doesn't speak much about their past anymore, and I've stopped asking. But Angela's warning remains with me, a stark reminder that some things in the world defy explanation, and sometimes ignorance is not just bliss, it's a necessity. It had been a long day at the office, and all I wanted was the comfort of my couch and the quiet of my apartment. The building I lived in wasn't new, but it had its charm, and was close enough to work that I rarely complained. That evening, as usual, I walked into the lobby, greeted the night shift security guard with a tired nod, and made my way to the elevator. I pressed the button for my floor, the 8th, and leaned back against the wall as the doors closed. The elevator began its ascent, the familiar hum and a slight vibration underfoot, a kind of nightly ritual after my long days. But that night, something felt off almost immediately. The elevator seemed to accelerate, moving faster than it ever had, the numbers on the panel lighting up rapidly. 9, 10, 11, it should have stopped, but it didn't. The numbers kept climbing. 12, 13, 14. Panic started to set in as the floors ticked higher, reaching numbers I knew didn't exist in my 12-story building. 15, 16, 17. The lights in the elevator flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The panel's numbers became a blur, no longer making any sense, as if the elevator had taken on a mind of its own. I frantically pressed the emergency button, but there was no response, no bell, no slowing down. The elevator seemed to be shooting upwards into an abyss, disconnected from the reality of my apartment building. My heart pounded in my chest, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead as I braced myself against the side of the elevator, unsure if or when this ride would end. Finally, with a jolt that threw me off balance, the elevator came to a stop. The doors hesitated for a moment, then slowly slid open. I braced myself to see the hallway of my apartment floor, hoping that this bizarre experience was just a product of my overworked, stressed-out mind. But the scene before me was completely unfamiliar. The doors had opened to a vast, ornate hallway, lined with doors that were far more lavish than those in my modest building. The carpet was a deep red, the walls adorned with intricate wood panelling, and hanging chandeliers that cast a warm, golden glow. It looked like something out of a luxury hotel or a historic estate, not a residential building in the middle of the city. Stunned, I stepped out, my mind racing to make sense of what was happening. Was this a dream? Had I somehow been transported to another place entirely? The hall was silent, eerily so, and as I ventured a few steps away from the elevator, I noticed that each door bore a plaque with names engraved in gold script. None of the names were familiar, and there was a palpable sense of timelessness in the air, as if this place existed out of any era I could recognize. After a few moments of disbelief, I turned back to the elevator, intent on pressing the button for the ground floor and hoping to reverse this inexplicable journey. But to my increasing horror, the elevator doors had closed, and no amount of pressing the call button would open them. Feeling a mix of fear and desperation, I chose a direction and started walking, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. Each door I passed was firmly shut, and there was no sign of anyone else in this strange, opulent version of an apartment floor. Eventually, I found a staircase and began a tentative descent, the soft echo of my steps bouncing off the marble walls. Down and down I went, my sense of unease growing with every floor that seemed just as deserted and timeless as the last. It felt like an eternity before I finally emerged, not onto the familiar lobby of my building, but onto a bustling, turn-of-the-century street scene that was straight out of history. Cars were replaced by horse-drawn carriages, the people dressed in fashions a century old. The air was filled with the sounds of a city from another time, and as I stood there, utterly lost and disoriented, I realized that the elevator hadn't just taken me up beyond my floor, it had taken me somewhere else entirely, somewhere beyond the confines of time and space as I understood them. As I navigated through this historical echo, searching for any clue that might lead me back to my world, the reality of my situation settled in. I was lost, perhaps irrevocably so, in a place that was familiar in its urban structure, but alien in every other possible way. The journey back, if there was one, was going to be far more complicated than any late-night elevator ride home. It was late on a Thursday night, and the local supermarket was almost deserted. I had decided to do my grocery shopping at this unusual hour to avoid the usual crowds and the chaos that came with them. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as I pushed my cart down the quiet aisles, the sound of my own wheels echoing slightly in the emptiness. As I turned into the cereal aisle, my attention was immediately drawn to a small figure standing alone between the shelves. It was a little girl, no more than 5 or 6 years old, her hair in messy pigtails, and wearing a faded red dress. She was staring intently at the boxes of cereal, as if making a very serious decision. I paused, puzzled. It was far too late for such a young child to be here without an adult. Approaching her cautiously, I asked, "Hey there, are you lost? Where's your mom or dad?" She didn't respond, just turned her large, wide eyes towards me. There was something unsettling about her gaze, something too knowing for a child her age. I felt a chill despite the warmth of the store. Thinking she might be scared or shy, I smiled gently and said, "I'll help you find them, okay." I reached for my phone intending to call for store security, but when I looked up from the screen, she was gone. I scanned the aisle, perplexed. It was straight, and I could see down both ends. There was no way she could have run off without me seeing. Confused and increasingly concerned, I abandoned my cart and hurried towards the front of the store. I told the cashier, a young man who looked like he was just ready to end his shift, about the little girl. His reaction was not what I expected. The colour drained from his face as I described her, and his voice was unsteady as he told me, "That sounds like a girl who used to live nearby. She went missing a few years ago. People say they still see her around sometimes." The casualness with which he relayed this information did little to calm my nerves. A missing child's ghost appearing in a supermarket. It sounded like something out of a horror movie, not something I expected to encounter on my late-night grocery run. I left the supermarket that night with my head swirling with thoughts of the little girl. The cashier's words echoed in my mind, painting a somber picture of a community haunted by an unresolved sorrow. As I drove home, the empty streets seemed to mirror the emptiness that the family must have felt, leaving behind everything they knew in the hope of escaping their grief. The image of the girl's solemn stare, so intense and yet so void of the vibrant energy a child her age should have, lingered in front of me every time I blinked. Over the next few days, I found myself drawn into researching more about her case. I scoured online news archives, reading every article about her disappearance, the search efforts, and the heartbreaking toll it took on her family and the community. The reports were a mosaic of sorrow, confusion, and the tireless pursuit of answers that led nowhere. Neighbours and strangers had banded together for weeks, combing through every inch of the local area, but all efforts had faded as leads turned cold. The girl had simply vanished, leaving no trace behind except for the memories those who knew her held on to, and now the haunting sightings and places she once frequented. Driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, I asked him more about the girl. He shared that her family had lived in the neighbourhood until her disappearance shattered their lives. They moved away shortly after, unable to bear the weight of their loss. Since then, sightings of the girl had become an eerie local legend, with some saying she appeared to remind people she was still missing, still waiting to be found. The encounter stayed with me, a ghostly reminder of a tragedy that had never found resolution. Each time I passed the supermarket after that night, a part of me looked for her, half dreading and half hoping that she would appear again. But she never did, and her story, like so many others, remained unresolved, suspended in the empty space between the known and the unknown. Every evening, my journey home from work is the same. I exit the bustling city centre, hop onto the quiet subway, and embark on a brisk 10-minute walk from the station to my apartment. The path is familiar, so much so that I could probably traverse it with my eyes closed. But recently, something or rather, someone has disrupted the monotony of my nightly routine. It began subtly. One night, as I strolled past the old, dimly lit street that intersects with mine, I noticed a figure under the streetlight. It was a man, standing so still he could have been mistaken for a statue. His presence was unnerving. He didn't move or speak. His gaze, however, followed me as I walked by. I quickened my pace, attributing the eerie feeling to my overactive imagination. However, as the nights progressed, so did the consistency of his appearances. No matter the time I passed by, whether early in the evening or well past midnight, he was there, always in the same spot, under the same streetlight, staring in silence as I hurried home. Curiosity mixed with a hint of fear began to gnaw at me. Who was he? What did he want? Why was he always there, yet only noticeable to me? One particular evening, Driven by a blend of courage and a desperate need for answers, I decided to confront the mysterious figure. The night air was crisp, and a light fog had begun to settle over the street, adding a ghostly quality to the dimly lit path. As I neared the streetlight, my heart pounded in my chest. He was there, as always, his features obscured by the shadows. Determined, I continued forward, my footsteps echoing slightly on the quiet street. But as I approached, something strange happened. The closer I got, the more his figure seemed to dissipate, like mist being swallowed by the air. By the time I reached the spot where he stood, there was nothing left but a dark, vaguely human-shaped shadow on the pavement. Confused and more than a little frightened, I looked around, half expecting him to reappear from behind the streetlight, or to laugh at my bewilderment from a nearby hiding spot. But there was nothing. No sound but the distant hum of the city, no movement but the trembling leaves on the autumn trees. The next day, haunted by the encounter, I visited the local library to see if there was any history or legend tied to that streetlight or the area that might explain the apparition. I learned that decades ago, a young man had been fatally struck by a car in a hit-and-run just a few yards from where the streetlight now stood. No one had ever been charged for the incident, and it had become a forgotten piece of the neighborhood's history. This piece of information sent a shiver down my spine. Could it be that the figure was, in some way, a manifestation of that young man? A lingering presence, rooted to the spot of his untimely departure from the world. I shuddered at the thought, but it seemed as plausible an explanation as any. Nights passed, and I continued to see him, always in the same place, always disappearing as I approached. I began to change my route, avoiding the streetlight altogether. Yet, the image of the man under the streetlight haunted me. I started researching more about spirits and apparitions, driven by a mixture of fear and fascination. Each article, each book suggested that some spirits remain earthbound due to unresolved issues or sudden deaths. One chilly evening, armed with a newfound resolve and a small bouquet of flowers, I returned to the streetlight. I placed the flowers on the exact spot where I had seen him vanish, a symbolic gesture of acknowledgement and peace. I spoke softly into the night, expressing my hope that he would find rest, that whatever tethered him to that streetlight would release him. Since that night, the figure no longer appears under the streetlight. Whether it was my actions or simply time that healed unseen wounds, I can't say. Now when I pass by that old streetlight on my way home, there's just a faint outline of a shadow on the ground, almost imperceptible unless you know where to look. And every time I nod slightly in silent greeting and farewell, a quiet acknowledgement of the soul who once stood there watching. It was late one Tuesday evening, and I was catching up with my friend Anna over the phone. We were exchanging updates on our lives and sharing a few laughs about past college antics when suddenly the line went dead. There was a brief moment of silence before it was replaced by an eerie crackling sound that seemed almost rhythmic, as if it were trying to form a pattern. Confused, I pulled the phone away from my ear, staring at the screen to see if the call was still connected. It wasn't. The display indicated the call had ended, so I tried calling Anna back, thinking it was just a poor connection issue. However, every attempt I made resulted in an instant diversion to her voicemail. That was odd. Her phone never went straight to voicemail. A few minutes of puzzlement passed as I debated whether to send a text or just wait for her to call back. Before I could decide, my phone rang, displaying Anna's name. Relieved, I answered quickly, expecting to hear her apologize for the dropped call. But instead of her voice, all I heard was a series of indistinct whispers. They were so faint, I wasn't even sure they were real at first. "Anna, is that you?" I asked, pressing the phone closer to my ear, trying to make out any clear words from the whispering. There was no response, just continuous, soft murmuring that sent a chill down my spine. Concerned, I hung up and tried calling her again, but just like before, it went straight to voicemail. The whispers lingered in my mind, unsettling me. They didn't sound like any technical glitch I'd ever heard. They sounded almost intentional. Unable to reach her, and filled with an inexplicable sense of urgency, I decided to drive over to Anna's apartment. The streets were quiet, the late hour casting a stillness over the city that only added to my growing anxiety. When I arrived, I buzzed her apartment several times, but there was no answer. That's when panic truly set in. I called her number again, standing outside her door, hoping to hear her phone ring inside. Again, voicemail. Just as I was contemplating calling the police, a neighbour came into the hallway. He noticed my distress and mentioned seeing Anna earlier in the evening, heading out with some friends. He hadn't seen her return yet. Confused, I thanked him and stepped outside to call one of her other friends, hoping someone would know where she was. It turned out Anna was fine. She was at a friend's house where they'd been watching movies and had turned her phone off for the night. Relieved but still shaken, I returned home, trying to make sense of what had happened. Why had her phone called me? And what were those whispers? I never found out why the phone call occurred, or what the whispers were. Anna checked her phone logs the next day. The outgoing calls to my number that night were not listed. It was as if the call had never happened, yet the whispers haunted me. I researched phone anomalies and unexplained phenomena, but nothing matched the experience. This event profoundly impacted my daily life and interactions. The sound of my phone ringing began to stir a sense of dread, with each call igniting a flare of anxiety over what I might hear on the other line. Even well-meaning calls from friends or family became a source of stress, as I hesitated before answering, bracing myself for the possibility of another encounter with the unknown. This ongoing tension did not go unnoticed. Loved ones commented on my newfound jumpiness and hesitance to engage in long conversations. Despite their concerns and questions, I found it difficult to share the full extent of my experience, fearing it would be too hard to understand without sounding irrational. The memory of the whispers haunted me, suggesting that whatever had reached out that night might still be lingering, waiting for another chance to communicate. This incident left me with a deep unease that lingered long after. I found myself hesitant to answer calls, especially unknown numbers, and the sound of static on a line made my heart race. The rational part of me knew it was likely some strange, explainable interference, but another part couldn't shake the feeling that something inexplicable had reached out that night, making a connection that was meant only for me to hear. From the moment my little sister, Mia, received the doll as a gift, something about it unsettled me. It was a porcelain doll with glassy blue eyes that seemed almost too lifelike, and a small painted smile that never quite seemed friendly. Despite my reservations, Mia adored it, naming it Charlotte and giving it a place of honor on a little chair in her room. One afternoon, I passed by Mia's room and noticed that Charlotte wasn't in her usual spot. Assuming Mia was playing with it somewhere, I didn't think much of it at first. But later that day, I found Charlotte sitting on the living room couch, staring blankly ahead. I picked the doll up, a chill running down my spine at the cold touch of its porcelain skin, and returned it to Mia's room. "Mia, please keep Charlotte in your room," I told her gently, not wanting to scare her with my own irrational fears. "But I haven't played with Charlotte in weeks," Mia replied, her voice filled with the innocent sincerity that only a child can muster. This statement stopped me in my tracks. if Mia hadn't moved the doll, who had. Over the next few days, Charlotte seemed to appear in the most unlikely places. I'd find her perched on the kitchen counter, or sitting on the bathroom floor, and each discovery filled me with an increasing sense of dread. Each time, I would return the doll to Mia's room, confusion and a growing sense of alarm brewing within me. Determined to unravel this mystery, I decided to talk to Mia again. "Are you sure you're not moving Charlotte around?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. Mia shook her head vehemently. "No, I told you, I don't like her anymore. She looks at me at night," Mia confessed, lowering her voice to a whisper. This revelation sent shivers down my spine, her words echoing my own fears about the doll's unsettling eyes. That night, I lay in bed, the unease growing in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something unnatural was occurring within our home. The sound of something soft shuffling across the floor startled me, and I lay frozen, listening intently in the dark. The house was silent again, but sleep eluded me for the rest of the night. The next morning, I found Charlotte at the end of the hallway, facing my bedroom door. It was the final straw. I grabbed the doll and decided to lock it away in the attic. The attic was dim and filled with boxes of forgotten belongings, a thin layer of dust coating everything. I placed Charlotte in a box, wrapping her in an old blanket to ensure she wouldn't be easily uncovered. A sense of relief washed over me as I closed the attic door, but it was short-lived. The next day, to my horror, I found Charlotte back in Mia's room. This time, she was seated right by Mia's bed, her blue eyes staring intently at the doorway. Mia clung to me, refusing to go near the doll. I knew then that we had to get rid of it. I took Charlotte to a local antique shop, explaining to the owner that we simply didn't want it anymore. The owner, an elderly man with a keen interest in such items, looked the doll over carefully. "Ah, these dolls have a way of becoming attached to their homes," he said cryptically. "Are you sure it's unwanted?" His question unnerved me, but I nodded, eager to be free of it. After leaving the shop, I felt a lightness I hadn't felt in weeks. The house seemed brighter, more welcoming, and Mia returned to her cheerful self. We never saw Charlotte again, but Mia sometimes mentioned hearing soft whispers at night, long after the doll was gone. I told myself it was just our imagination, remnants of the fear Charlotte had instilled in us. The experience left us wary of similar dolls, and Mia never asked for another one again. Sometimes, when we pass by that antique shop, I can't help but look inside, half expecting to see Charlotte sitting in the window, looking out at the world she was forced to leave. But she never appears, and part of me hopes she found her place, wherever it may be, far from here. The memory of the moving doll continues to linger in our home, a spooky tale of our own that we sometimes share with others, though seldom without a glance over our shoulders, just to be sure. Every evening after dinner, I take a free time walk through my neighborhood. It's a quaint area, with tree-lined streets and a mix of old and new homes that give it a charming, timeless feel. I know most corners and crevices of this neighborhood, or so I thought. One evening, however, something unusual caught my eye, a house that I had never noticed before. It was an old structure, tucked away behind a slew of overgrown bushes and a decrepit fence that seemed to groan under the weight of neglect. The house itself was a Victorian style, with peeling paint and boarded-up windows that suggested it had been abandoned for years. Its presence was so incongruous that I stopped in my tracks, puzzled. How had I never seen this house before? Driven by curiosity, I approached the house, the gravel crunching under my feet, breaking the eerie silence that seemed to envelope the property. The garden was wild and untamed, with weeds and vines creeping up the sides of the house as if trying to recling it back to the earth. As I got closer, a chill ran through me, not from the evening's cool air, but from the unmistakable feeling of being watched. I quickened my pace, circling the house to look for any signs of life, but there was none, only the echoes of my own footsteps. The next day, the image of the mysterious house haunted me. I decided to go back, perhaps in daylight. The house would seem less foreboding, and perhaps I could find some clue as to its history. Armed with my curiosity, I retraced my steps from the previous evening. However, as I neared the location where the house had stood, I was met with a shocking sight, an empty lot. The overgrown bushes, the creaking gate, the house itself, were all gone. In their place was an empty field, with nothing but a few scattered wildflowers swaying in the breeze. Confused, I wondered if I had made a mistake, if I had somehow gotten the location wrong. But no, I was certain this was the place. I walked around, looking for any sign that the house had been recently demolished, but there was nothing, including no rubble, no debris, nothing that indicated a house had ever existed there. It was as if the house had simply vanished overnight. My mind raced with possibilities. Had I imagined the entire thing? No, the vision had been too vivid, too real. I spoke to a few neighbours, asking if they knew of a house that once stood there. Each neighbour shook their head, some bemused, others wary of my questions. No house has stood there for decades. One elderly neighbour told me, her eyes narrowing slightly, not since the old Farley place burned down in the 60s. Nothing's been built there since. The revelation sent shivers down my spine. Burned down. I couldn't reconcile the solid, though decrepit, structure I'd seen with a house that had been reduced to ashes 50 years ago. I visited the local library and pored over old newspapers and records, looking for any mention of the Farley house. The librarian found an article about the fire. It included a photo of the house before it was destroyed. It was unmistakably the house I had seen. According to the article, the house was considered a total loss, and the cause of the fire was never determined. The Farleys, devastated by the loss, moved away, and the lot remained vacant, a silent testament to the tragedy. Over time, the neighbourhood grew around the empty lot, the memory of the Farley house fading until only the older residents remembered it. As I walked home, the article folded in my pocket, I felt a surreal connection to the past, as if I had stepped through a veil of time into a moment long gone. The house I had seen was a ghost, a shadow of what once was, replaying its last days to an audience of one. Every evening, I continue my walks, my eyes inevitably drawn to the empty lot. It remains just an empty patch of green. But sometimes, just as the sun sets and the shadows lengthen, I can almost see the outline of the house, ethereal and fleeting. It's a vanishing house, a memory of the past that refuses to be completely forgotten, and I, a solitary witness to its spectral existence. When I first toured the apartment, I was captivated by its charm and the sheer amount of sunlight that bathed the living room in warmth. It seemed like the perfect place, nestled in a quiet part of town, just close enough to the hustle and bustle, but still serene. My decision to move in was quick, driven by a gut feeling that this was the fresh start I needed. For the first few weeks, everything was idyllic. I settled into my new routine and began to personalize my space, hanging art and placing cherished mementos around each room. However, it wasn't long before I noticed something odd, something I hadn't felt during my initial visits, a persistent cold spot in the hallway outside the bathroom. At first, I dismissed it as a quirk of the apartment, perhaps a draft I hadn't noticed before. But as the days passed, the area remained inexplicably cold, regardless of how warm the rest of the apartment was. I checked the windows and doors nearby for any signs of a draft, but found nothing that could explain the chill that seemed to linger in that particular spot. Curious and a bit unnerved, I bought a small thermometer to monitor the temperature. To my surprise, the temperature in that spot was consistently several degrees colder than the rest of the apartment. I mentioned it in passing to my landlord, half-jokingly suggesting the place might be haunted. He laughed, brushing off my comment with a remark about the building's old pipes and quirky heating system. But one night, the nature of the cold spot shifted from a minor curiosity to something decidedly more sinister. It was past midnight, and the apartment was silent, wrapped in the deep calm that only comes in the small hours of the morning. I was walking down the hallway when I felt the now familiar chill. This time, however, as I paused, a new sensation washed over me, the distinct sound of breathing. The sound was faint, barely more than a whisper, but unmistakably human. It seemed to emanate directly from the coldest part of the hallway. I stood frozen, straining my ears, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. The sound was rhythmic and steady, like that of someone deep in sleep. Yet, it filled the space around me, enveloping me in an icy shroud. Heart racing, I flicked on the hallway light, half expecting to find someone standing there. But there was nothing, just the empty hallway and the lingering sound of breathing, which faded away as suddenly as it had appeared. Sleep was elusive the rest of that night. The next day, driven by a mix of fear and determination, I began to research the history of the building. My search led me to the local library, where I pored over old newspapers and public records. After hours of digging, I stumbled upon a chilling piece of history. A decade ago, a young woman had died in the apartment under mysterious circumstances. Her death had occurred in what was now my apartment, and the reports suggested that her last moments were spent in the hallway, where she had collapsed and succumbed to an undiagnosed medical condition. The revelation sent a chill down my spine. Could it be that the cold spot was in some way connected to the tragedy that had occurred in my apartment? Was I experiencing some residual haunting, an echo of the life that had abruptly ended in that very spot? Determined to find peace, and perhaps bring some to whatever remnants lingered in my home, I consulted with a local medium. Skeptical but desperate, I invited her to the apartment. She walked through each room, pausing in the hallway where the cold spot was most intense. After a moment of silence, she quietly explained that she sensed a presence, a lingering sadness confined to that spot. Following her advice, I held a small ceremony to acknowledge the woman's untimely death, and spoke words of release, hoping to aid in her passing to whatever lay beyond. I lit candles and placed flowers in the hallway, creating a small memorial in her honor. In the days that followed, the temperature in the hallway began to normalize. The cold spot gradually faded, and with it, the eerie sensation of being watched. The apartment warmed, not just in temperature, but in atmosphere. Now, months later, the hallway no longer chills me to the bone. Instead, it feels just like any other part of my home, warm and inviting. Yet, sometimes when I pass through, I whisper a quiet thanks to the woman who once called this place home, grateful for the peace we have both found. It was just past midnight when the first knock echoed through my quiet apartment. I had been curled up with a book, the kind of night where the world outside seemed miles away. Another sharp knock snapped me back to reality, prompting me to set my book aside and shuffle toward the door. Peering through the peephole, my eyes met only the dimly lit, empty hallway of my apartment building. Opening the door, a rush of cool air brushed against my face, but there was no one in sight. Confused but not overly concerned, I chalked it up to maybe a neighbor's door closing or some other benign cause. The next night, however, As the clock once again struck midnight, the knocking resumed. This time it was louder, more insistent. I rushed to the door and checked the peephole with a sense of urgency, but again the hallway was clear. Frustration and a touch of fear began to mingle as I flung the door open, only to find nothing but the quiet, unassuming corridor of my floor. Over the next few days, the pattern continued, each knock growing more determined. Each time, I would race to the door, fling it open, or peer through the peephole, only to find nothing. The mystery of the nocturnal visitor who never seemed to be there started to weigh on me. I mentioned the incidents to a neighbour, hoping perhaps they had noticed something off as well, but their confused shrug only deepened the mystery. Determined to get to the bottom of things, I set up a small camera in the peephole, hoping to capture whatever prankster or malfunction was causing the noise. That night, as I lay in bed, the knocking came again, sharp and clear in the quiet of the night. I leaped from my bed and ran to the door, heart pounding in the stillness. As expected, the hallway was empty, but this time I had the camera. I quickly reviewed the footage, my hands trembling with a mix of anticipation and dread. The video showed the hallway remaining completely empty, even as the sound of the knocking echoed during the recording. The next day, I showed the video to a few friends, trying to find a rational explanation for knocks that seemed to come from nowhere. Suggestions ranged from piping issues to the building settling, but none could really explain the precise, deliberate knocks. That night, I decided to stay up and watch the hallway live from my peephole camera. The minutes ticked by slowly until midnight approached. Right on schedule, the knocking started, soft at first, then growing louder and more urgent. I kept my eye glued to the screen, the camera showing the empty hallway, when suddenly a chill ran down my spine. I realized the knocking wasn't coming from the door at all. It was coming from below. It seemed to emanate from the floor, or perhaps even below the floorboards. The next morning, fueled by a night devoid of sleep and filled with eerie revelations, I contacted the building manager to inquire about the history of the building, and specifically, anything unusual about my unit. He hesitated at first, then shared that decades ago, before the building was renovated into apartments, it had housed a small, obscure bookstore, and before that, it was a private residence where rumour had it the original owner had passed away after a long, solitary illness. Curious and not a little unnerved, I pressed him for more details, but he had little else to offer, suggesting perhaps the knocking was some residual echo from the past, a theory I wasn't ready to accept without more proof. Determined to understand the source of the disturbances, I reached out to a local historian who specialized in the area's history. Through her, I learned more about the building's original owner, a reclusive man who was said to have been both deeply eccentric and intensely private, traits that led to many local myths after his passing. She also mentioned that strange occurrences hadn't been uncommon in the building through the years, with past residents reporting everything from unexplained noises to fleeting shadows. Armed with this new information, I felt a mix of vindication and dread. It seemed increasingly likely that the knocks were not just random disturbances, but perhaps manifestations tied to the building's rich and storied past. One night, driven by a mix of fear and resolve, I placed a recorder in the hallway, hoping to catch any auditory evidence of the phenomena. The knocks came again, recorded this time in clear, undeniable waves. I played the recording for the historian, and her intrigued yet cautious reaction confirmed that whatever was causing the knocks was no ordinary occurrence. It was an ordinary Friday evening in early fall, and the sun was just beginning to set, casting long, dramatic shadows across the park where my friend Elise and I decided to unwind after a hectic week. The air was crisp, carrying the promise of a cold night as the last hints of daylight faded. We found ourselves a quaint spot on an old wooden bench, near the edge of a sprawling forest that bordered the park. Here, we settled into comfortable chatter, filling each other in on the trivialities of our week. As darkness encroached, the park grew quieter, with families and joggers slowly trickling out towards home. Our conversation was abruptly interrupted by a strange, metallic scraping sound emanating from the direction of the woods. It was odd and out of place, a stark contrast to the natural evening sounds of rustling leaves and distant traffic. Ellis's eyes lit up with curiosity, a trait I had always admired yet often found unnerving in situations like these. "Let's check it out," she suggested eagerly, already standing and peering into the shadowy underbrush of the forest. I hesitated, the unease settling in as the woods seemed to grow darker and more forbidding with each passing minute. I proposed we just ignore it and head back since it was getting late, but Elise was adamant. "Come on, it'll be an adventure," she insisted. But I remained on the bench, my instinct screaming that going into the woods at night was a bad idea. Elise shrugged, a mischievous grin on her face, and walked alone into the darkening woods. I watched her silhouette grow smaller, swallowed up by the night until she was no longer visible. The forest seemed to absorb her, the crunch of her steps fading into a suffocating silence. I waited, feeling a mixture of annoyance and worry, expecting her to come sprinting back, laughing at her own daring. Minutes passed, but Elise did not return. The playful anxiety I felt turned into genuine concern. I called out her name, my voice loud in the still night, but only silence greeted me. As the cold seeped through my jacket, I decided to go after her, stepping reluctantly into the forest. The trees seemed to close in around me, and the path, clear just minutes ago, now seemed labyrinthine and menacing. I ventured as far as I dared, my phone's flashlight cutting through the darkness. Still, there was no sign of Elise. Panic began to set in, and I hurried back to the park to call for help. At the police station, confusion set in when the officers insisted that surveillance footage from the park entrance showed I had been alone all evening. Despite my protests, the evidence was irrefutable in their eyes. I insisted they check the woods, and though skeptical, they agreed to a search. The search lasted throughout the night and into the next day, but there was no trace of Elise. It was as if the earth had swallowed her whole. The police were puzzled, but without evidence of foul play, their efforts began to wane. Friends and family joined in, flyers were distributed, and the local community rallied in support, yet everyone was baffled by her sudden disappearance. Days turned into weeks with no word from or about Elise. The strain of not knowing what had happened to my friend was unbearable. I revisited the park many times, each visit a mix of hope and heartache, half expecting to see her emerge from the woods with a laugh and an explanation that would make all the pain and mystery disappear. But she never did. The reality of the situation settled in heavy. I began to research similar disappearances, clinging to any thread that might explain the night's events. Stories of otherworldly phenomena, folklore about spirits in the woods, and tales of unexplained occurrences filled my nights as I searched for answers that seemed increasingly unattainable. Months later, the active search for Elise was called off. The case grew cold, but not my need to know her fate. I continued my own investigations, speaking with experts in paranormal activity, exploring theories about spatial anomalies, and even consulting psychics. Anything that could offer a clue was a path worth following. Excitement washed over me as I unboxed my new phone. It was the latest model, boasting a camera of unparalleled quality among its many features. Eager to test its capabilities, I decided to take a leisurely stroll through my neighborhood, capturing snapshots of the quaint streets and vibrant life around me. The day was perfect for photography: clear skies, a gentle breeze, and just enough sunlight to make everything look slightly more beautiful. I wandered around, clicking pictures of blooming gardens, charming houses, and bustling street corners. Occasionally, I'd stop to chat with neighbours or pet a friendly dog that came my way. It felt good to connect with my surroundings in such a visually engaging way, and my new phone seemed to capture every detail with incredible precision. Returning home, I transferred the photos to my computer for a better look. As I flipped through the images, a chill crept down my spine. In the background of each photo, barely noticeable at first, was a man. He appeared average in every way, with nondescript clothing and a plain face that would be easy to lose in a crowd, except for one disturbing detail. I had not seen him while taking the photos. The first few pictures showed him at a considerable distance, a blurred figure that might have been dismissed as a trick of the light or a passerby. But as I continued to look through the set, he appeared in each one, progressively closer to the camera. His expression was stoic, his eyes fixed directly on the lens as if he was aware of being captured in the frame. My heart raced as I reviewed the photos, each click a foreboding echo in the quiet of my room. In the last photo I had taken, he was unsettlingly close, standing just behind a swing set in the park, looking directly at me, or at the camera, with an intensity that felt almost palpable. I couldn't recall seeing anyone that day who matched his description, and I certainly would have noticed someone looming so close. Disturbed by the discovery, I decided to visit the locations again, hoping to either catch the man or prove to myself that it was some bizarre coincidence or fault in the camera. With a friend accompanying me for courage, we retraced my steps, me with my phone ready to snap photos, hoping to either capture him again or somehow dispel the growing dread that had taken hold of me. The streets were just as lively, the gardens just as vibrant, but the man from the photos was nowhere to be seen. I took the same routes, paused at the same spots, but he did not appear in any new photos. The relief was temporary, as the mystery of his prior appearances gnawed at me. Was he real, or had my new phone somehow fabricated his presence? Seeking answers, I consulted a local photography club, showing them the series of pictures, hiding my trepidation behind a mask of curiosity about photographic anomalies. The members were intrigued, suggesting theories from double exposure to digital glitches, though none could explain the progressive nature of the man's appearances in the photos. One older member, a retired photographer with decades of experience, suggested something more unsettling. He spoke of spectral impressions, images of entities that aren't visible to the naked eye, but can occasionally be captured by the sensitive sensors of modern digital cameras. His theory was met with mixed reactions, but it struck a chord with me, a possibility as terrifying as it was fascinating. As days turned into weeks, I continued my explorations, always keeping an eye out for the man. The photos ceased to show his presence, which should have eased my mind, but instead left me with a piercing sense of unease. The world felt slightly off-kilter, as if I was constantly being watched, though a glance over my shoulder never revealed anything out of the ordinary. One evening, reviewing the images yet again, I noticed something that had previously escaped my attention. In each photo where he appeared, the man was not just moving closer to the camera, but also closer to a particular house in my neighbourhood. With a mix of dread and determination, I approached the house the next day, knocking tentatively. An elderly woman answered, her face etched with lines of kindness and years of wisdom. I explained my strange experience, showing her the pictures. Her reaction was a mixture of shock and sorrow. She revealed that her son, who matched the description of the man in the photos, had disappeared years ago without a trace. The photos, she believed, were a sign that he was still here, in some form, trying to come home. The small habits we develop over time, the quirks that define our daily routines, often go unnoticed until something interrupts them. For me, it was the simple act of leaving my closet door slightly ajar, a small crack just wide enough to see the comforting outline of clothes and the faint glow of the streetlight filtering through the window. This habit, however, began to unravel as I noticed a peculiar change. The door, which I was certain I left open each night, was consistently found closed each morning. At first, I dismissed it as forgetfulness. Perhaps I was closing it in my sleep, or maybe it was a draft, although the latter seemed unlikely in my well-sealed apartment. But as this phenomenon persisted, a seed of unease was planted in my mind. I decided to test my theory by placing a chair in front of the door one night, thinking this would surely keep it from moving. To my disbelief, the morning light revealed the chair pushed aside and the door firmly shut. The situation escalated one quiet night, breaking the boundary from curious to terrifying. I was jolted awake by the distinct sound of the closet door creaking slowly. My heart pounded as I lay frozen, staring into the darkness. As my eyes adjusted, I glimpsed what looked like fingers, pale and thin, curling around the edge of the door, gently pulling it closed. The sight was so shocking, so distinctly real, that I couldn't muster the scream that built in my throat. The next morning, under the harsh light of day, I inspected the closet. It was mundane, filled with the usual array of clothing in boxes, nothing to suggest it could serve as a hiding spot for whatever I thought I had seen. Rational explanations raced through my mind, battling the raw fear that had taken root. Perhaps it was a trick of the light, or maybe I was just dreaming. Determined to prove to myself it was the latter, I set up my phone to record the closet area overnight, hoping to capture evidence of a draft or some other benign cause. That night, with my phone propped up on my dresser and recording, I tried to sleep. However, sleep was elusive, and every small noise seemed amplified. The creak of the floorboards, the distant sound of traffic, it all kept me alert. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. I woke up with a start before dawn, the room unnaturally cold. Glancing at the closet, I saw that the door was once again closed. With a trembling hand, I played back the recording. The footage was uneventful for the most part until about 3 a.m., when the closet door slowly began to creak open on its own. Then, just as slowly, it began to close. This time, the camera caught it. Fingers, definitely fingers, pale against the dark wood, pulling the door shut. The video offered no comfort, only confirmation that something inexplicable was occurring. I contacted a friend who dabbled in paranormal investigations, driven by a mix of desperation and disbelief. He was intrigued and agreed to spend the night in the apartment to observe any anomalies himself. Equipped with more sophisticated recording gear and sensors, we prepared to face whatever might happen. Yet, the night passed without incident, the closet door remaining immobile, the sensors quiet. My friend suggested that whatever was happening might be tied specifically to me, an unsettling thought that left me more isolated with my experience. He recommended a cleansing ritual, sometimes used in situations where unexplained phenomena occur, which we performed together. The ritual was simple but profound, involving salt, sage, and the steady, spoken intention of reclaiming peace in my living space. Since then, the closet door has ceased its nightly movements. Whether it was the ritual or perhaps the entity's decision to move on, I cannot say. What remains is the lingering feeling of unease every time I glanced towards the closet, the memory of those fingers etched into my mind. While the physical manifestations have stopped, the psychological impact lingers, a shadow over my daily routine that may never fully recede. It began as a minor annoyance, an unknown number sending me cryptic messages. At first, I assumed it was a wrong number or a prank, brushing off the initial text that simply read, "I see you." But as more messages arrived, each more unsettling than the last, a deep sense of unease began to grow within me. The second message was even more direct and chilling. "Turn around." I remember the cold shiver that ran down my spine as I read it, standing alone in my kitchen. I spun around instinctively, half expecting to find someone lurking behind me. But there was nothing, just the quiet hum of my refrigerator and the soft flicker of a candle on the counter. Trying to shake off the fear, I convinced myself it was just a friend playing a joke on me. However, the next message left me truly frightened, coming through late one evening just as I was getting ready for bed. "I'm in your house." My heart raced as I immediately checked every lock on the doors and windows, each room, closet, and potential hiding place. My home, usually my sanctuary, felt like a vast, eerie trap. Finding nothing and no one, I reported the number to the police, but they could only promise to monitor the situation, suggesting it was likely just a prank. For a few weeks, the messages stopped, and life slowly returned to normal, or as normal as possible when shadows seemed to linger a little longer, and every unexpected noise made me jump. The memory of the messages haunted me, leaving me jumping at every ping from my phone. Then, one quiet night, as I was drifting off to sleep, my phone pinged again. I hesitated, my heart pounding in the darkness, before I reached for the phone. The screen lit up with a new message from the same unknown number. "Don't look outside." I froze, every fibre of my being screaming to ignore the message, to not give in to the fear. But curiosity and dread overwhelmed me, and I crept to the window, peering out into the night. Outside, the street was empty, bathed in the orange glow of the street lamps. As I scanned the scene, trying to spot anything amiss, my phone pinged again. "Look up." I raised my eyes to the second-story window across the street, where the silhouette of a person was visible through the curtains. They were standing perfectly still, facing my house. I stepped back from the window, my breath caught in my throat. I watched as the figure moved away from the window, disappearing from view. The messages stopped again after that night, but the damage was done. I felt watched, unsafe in my own home, paranoid about every shadow and sound. The fear led me to install security cameras around my property and change my phone number. I scoured local forums and online communities for anyone experiencing similar issues, hoping for answers or at least some solidarity. It seemed I was alone in my experience, which only deepened my fear and confusion. Months passed without incident, and the sharp edges of fear began to dull into the background noise of daily life. That was until one evening, while reviewing footage from the security cameras, I saw it. A figure briefly passing by a camera at the edge of my property. It was too far to see clearly, and it moved with an unsettling fluidity that made it hard to identify as definitively human. The police were called again, the footage reviewed, but no conclusions could be reached. The mystery of the messages, the figure, and the chilling interactions remained unsolved, leaving me in a perpetual state of alertness and paranoia. My home no longer felt like mine, each corner shadowed with the possibility of unseen eyes. I began to spend less time at home, staying over with friends and family, jumping at the chance for work trips. But no matter how far I travelled, the phantom texts followed me in the back of my mind, an unresolved echo of fear that whispered to me in quiet moments, reminding me of the vulnerability that came from simply being seen. Late one evening, as I settled into the quiet comfort of my third-floor apartment, the unexpected sound of a baby crying pierced the stillness. It seemed to come from right outside my window, an impossibility given my location high above any pedestrian traffic. Initially, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, the result of too many late nights, or the eerie audio from a TV show I had been half watching. But as the minutes passed, the crying only grew more intense, more real and impossible to ignore. Feeling a mix of concern and confusion, I approached the window, peering out into the dark, searching for any sign of someone on the ground or a nearby apartment window left ajar. There was nothing, just the quiet, empty street and the normal night sounds of the city. The crying continued, louder now, as if the baby were right outside, suspended in the air. It was unsettling, the sound so clear and so close yet completely untraceable. Deciding that action was needed, I opened the window fully, leaning out slightly to get a better sense of where the crying might be coming from. The night air was cool, brushing against my face, but it offered no clues, only the uninterrupted wail of a child in distress. It was irrational, eerie, and with no baby in sight, deeply troubling. With a growing sense of unease, I pulled back, shut the window, and drew the blinds, trying to shut out the noise. But the crying didn't diminish. If anything, it grew louder, more desperate, as if the baby could sense my attempt to shut it out. The sound was so pervasive, so clear, that it filled my apartment, echoing off the walls and seeping into every corner. My heart raced as I tried to drown it out with pillows over my ears, but it was futile. The wailing was relentless, pulling at something primal within me. Unable to bear it any longer, I called the police, my voice shaking as I explained the situation. The dispatcher was understandably skeptical, but promised to send a patrol car to check the area. I waited, pacing my apartment, the cries still piercing through the fabric of the night. When the officers arrived, I met them outside, the crying still audible to my ears, but their expressions quickly turned from concern to confusion. "We don't hear any crying," one officer told me, his brows furrowed as he and his partner listened intently. They checked around the building, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, finding nothing. No baby, no signs of anyone in distress. They suggested the noise might be coming from a device or a toy, perhaps accidentally activated and forgotten, a well-meaning suggestion, but one that didn't fit what I was experiencing. The officers left, and the crying eventually stopped as mysteriously as it had started, leaving me to sit in the silent aftermath, wondering if I had imagined the entire ordeal. Sleep was elusive that night, and many nights after, as I researched possibilities that might explain what I had heard. Stories of auditory hallucinations, ghostly phenomena, and unexplained sounds filled my search history, each theory more unsettling than the last. Over the next few weeks, the crying returned sporadically, never predictable, but always just as distressing. No one else seemed to hear it. Friends who stayed over heard nothing, and further calls to the police were met with polite skepticism. My apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt haunted by the cries of a child I could not help or find. Finally, driven by desperation, I contacted a local paranormal investigation team. Skeptical of such things but out of options, I watched as they set up their equipment, sensors, and recorders in an attempt to capture evidence of the sounds I was plagued by. That night, as we all sat in silence, the crying began again, this time recorded by their equipment, validating my experiences. The investigators were baffled, unable to provide immediate explanations, but fascinated by the recordings. They speculated about residual hauntings, perhaps tied to the land's history, before the apartment building was constructed. Though they promised to research further, there were no immediate answers, only the validation that the crying was real, not a product of my imagination. Living with the mystery of the crying baby became a part of life in that apartment. Though never explained, never fully understood, it was a phenomenon that marked my time there, a haunting melody that filled the night with sorrow, and the air with the echo of a presence unseen but deeply felt. Driving home late at night has always had its eerie set of challenges, from dimly lit roads to the solitude that surrounds. That night was no different, or so I thought, as I navigated the quiet streets of my hometown, the only sounds being the soft hum of my car's engine and the occasional rustle of leaves stirred by the breeze. The streetlights cast long shadows, flickering as I passed beneath them, adding an eerie tint to the mundane drive. Glancing in the rear-view mirror to check if any cars were behind me, I froze. There, in the back seat of my car, was the unmistakable figure of someone sitting, shrouded in the car's shadows. My heart raced as I stared into the mirror, the figure sitting motionlessly, staring back at me through the dim light. In a reflex of fear and disbelief, I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt on the deserted road. I whipped around, expecting to confront an intruder. But there was nothing. The back seat was empty, just as it had been when I left work. The only items present were my work bag and a few scattered pieces of gym equipment. Breathing heavily, I rubbed my eyes, questioning if fatigue was playing tricks on me. With a deep breath, I calmed my nerves and resumed driving, chalking it up to a shadow, or perhaps my imagination, fueled by the late hour. Yet, as I glanced in the rear-view mirror again, the figure reappeared. This time I could see more details, a pale, expressionless face, and eyes that seemed to pierce into mine. The sight was so vivid, so real, that I couldn't keep my eyes off the mirror, even as I tried to rationalize the impossibility of what I was seeing. My heart pounded as I pulled over to the side of the road, unwilling to look away from the mirror for fear that the figure might materialize beside me. With the car stopped, I turned on every light inside the vehicle, hoping to dispel any shadows that might be playing tricks on my mind. Again, I turned to face the back seat, and again, it was empty. No sign of anyone or anything that could be creating the image I had seen. The logical part of my mind battled with the terror that something unexplainable was happening, but the repeat appearances of the figure left me deeply unnerved. Determined to understand what was happening, I took out my phone and started recording a video, aiming to capture both the rear-view mirror and the back seat. If there was something there, maybe the camera would see it too, or perhaps I would capture something that my eyes alone could not. I resumed driving, the camera fixed on the mirror, my eyes darting between the road and the phone's screen. For minutes, nothing happened. The back seat remained visibly empty both in reality and on the video. Just as I began to feel foolish, a chill swept through the car despite the heater running, and the figure abruptly appeared in the mirror again on the video playback. This time I did not look away, did not stop the car. I watched as the figure seemed to acknowledge my fear with a slow, unsettling nod. After reaching home, I was hesitant to review the footage, afraid of validating the haunting experience. When I finally mustered the courage to look, the video showed exactly what I had feared. Every time I glanced away from the mirror, the figure would appear, seated silently, disappearing as soon as I turned to look directly at the back seat. The phenomenon defied explanation, a haunting that neither science nor logic could rationalize. In the days that followed, I avoided driving alone at night and eventually sought the help of a paranormal investigator who specialized in such anomalies. Their investigation turned up more questions than answers, suggesting a possible attachment to the vehicle or to me. I never fully understood what or who the figure was, nor did I ever see it again after selling the car. Yet, the memory of those eyes in the mirror, the inexplicable coldness, and the feeling of being watched from within my own car lingered long after. It was a stark reminder that some things in our world resist explanation, lurking on the periphery of our understanding, visible only through brief glimpses in a rear-view mirror. The first time I saw her, I thought she was a figment of my imagination, a shadow cast by the moonlight, or perhaps a trick of my sleep-addled brain. An old woman, standing silently in the corner of my bedroom, her gaze fixed upon me with an intensity that felt almost palpable. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes, and she was gone. I chalked it up to the remnants of a dream, the kind that lingers on the edge of wakefulness. Yet, as the nights progressed, her presence became a recurring phenomenon, eroding my dismissal as mere dreams. Each night, as the clock neared 3 in the morning, there she would be in the same corner. Whether the room was bathed in moonlight or shrouded in darkness, her form was unmistakable. She was dressed in an old-fashioned gown, her hair pulled back tightly, her eyes never blinking, never straying from me. The room would grow unnaturally cold whenever she appeared, a chill that seeped into my bones, making the atmosphere dense with an unspoken foreboding. I started to dread the nights. Sleep became elusive as my anxiety about her appearances grew. I was wide awake the first time I acknowledged her presence, my voice barely a whisper as I asked, "Who are you? What do you want?" She didn't respond, didn't so much as stir. She just stood there, watching me, her expression unreadable. The silence was suffocating, filling the room with a heavy, oppressive air. Determined to understand what was happening, I consulted everything from medical texts on sleep disorders to online forums about supernatural occurrences. None of the logical explanations fit. This wasn't sleep paralysis, nor a hallucination from stress. The consistency of her appearances, the tangible drop in temperature, and the relentless gaze that felt almost invasive, none of these could be neatly explained away. Out of desperation, I contacted a medium, skeptical, but willing to try anything to reclaim my nights from the haunting. The medium arrived with little fanfare, a small bag of tools in hand, and a calm demeanour that provided a small measure of comfort. She set up in my bedroom, lighting candles and murmuring softly as she invited the old woman to communicate. The air grew thick as the medium worked, her voice a steady, soothing cadence in the chilly room. Then, with a sudden drop in temperature, she spoke, her eyes closed. "She's bound to this place, to an object within these walls. She lingers because of a promise unkept, a vow to protect." The medium's words hung heavy in the air, turning my attention to an old jewellery box I had inherited and placed idly on my dresser, never really considering its origins. Guided by the medium, I opened the box, revealing its contents that I had never thoroughly examined, a collection of old photographs and letters, yellowed with age, delicate and fragile. The medium sifted through them with a reverent touch until she handed me a photograph. It was her, the old woman, captured in sepia tones, her expression as intense as the nights she visited me. The letters told a story of a woman who had lived through sorrow and loss, her final years marred by loneliness, her last words a promise to watch over her family's most cherished possessions. It seemed that in her mind, her duty extended beyond her death. With the medium's guidance, we crafted a small ceremony to acknowledge her vigil, to thank her for her guardianship, and to reassure her that it was okay to move on. That night, after the medium had left and the candles had been snuffed out, I felt a peace that had been absent for many nights. The woman did not appear in the corner of my room again. The cold spots and the oppressive air dissipated, replaced by a quiet warmth that seemed to bless the room. Though she never returned, the memory of her visits lingered. I kept the photograph displayed on my dresser, a nod of recognition and respect to her story and her presence. It was a stark reminder of how the past can linger, sometimes caught in the corners of our lives, waiting for someone to notice, to remember. The morning was ordinary, filled with the usual flurry of notifications and emails that accompany the start of a day. Among the routine alerts was a text from Jamie, my best friend since childhood, suggesting we meet for coffee at our favourite cafe downtown. The message was casual, peppered with inside jokes, and the easy banter that defined our long-standing friendship. Excited for a break in my otherwise monotonous day, I agreed enthusiastically, setting a time to meet in the early afternoon. I arrived at the cafe a few minutes early, securing a table by the window, one of the best spots in the place, where light flooded in, creating a warm, inviting glow. The cafe was bustling with the usual crowd, the air rich with the scent of roasted coffee beans and freshly baked pastries. I ordered a latte and a scone, watching the door for Jamie's arrival. However, minutes turned to a half hour, and Jamie still hadn't shown. Concern started to nag at me as I sent a couple of texts, each going unanswered. Deciding to call, I was met with the abrupt and unsettling message that the number I had dialed was disconnected. Confusion set in, my worry deepening. It wasn't like Jamie to vanish without a word, much less disconnect their phone. On impulse, I paid for my order and left the cafe, heading to Jamie's apartment, a sense of urgency quickening my steps. Arriving at Jamie's place, I was surprised to find an air of neglect about the property that was uncharacteristic of Jamie, who took pride in their home. The small garden was overgrown, and mail overflowed from the mailbox, untouched and collecting dust. I rang the doorbell, my heart sinking with each unanswered chime. A neighbour, recognizing me from previous visits, approached with a furrowed brow. "They haven't been around for weeks," the neighbour explained, their tone imbued with concern. "It's like they just up and vanished one day. No note, no calls, nothing. And you're the first person I've seen come by." The news hit me like a cold wave, the implications terrifying and incomprehensible. How could Jamie just disappear? Where could they have gone without any indication, any goodbye? Determined to find answers, I contacted the police to report Jamie missing. The officers took down the information with routine efficiency, but their nonchalant demeanour did little to ease my growing anxiety. Over the following days, I reached out to other friends and Jamie's family members, discovering to my dismay that I was not the only one who had lost contact. No one had any information. Jamie had seemingly disappeared without a trace. The search expanded as days turned into weeks. Flyers were posted, social media campaigns were launched, and the local community rallied in an effort to find any information that could lead to Jamie. Despite these efforts, there were no leads, no sightings, no digital footprints to follow. Jamie had vanished, leaving behind a void filled with unanswered questions. During this time, I wrestled with a torrent of emotions, confusion, fear, and a profound sense of loss. The cafe we once frequented became a place I avoided, each visit a stark reminder of the day Jamie failed to appear. I replayed that morning over and over, searching for any clue I might have missed, any sign that could explain the sudden disappearance. As months passed, the active search dwindled, though I never stopped looking for Jamie. I kept their number in my phone, unwilling to let go of the hope that one day it might ring and I'd hear their voice, explaining a mix-up, a mistake, or a reason they had to go away. But that call never came. The mystery of Jamie's disappearance remained just that, a mystery, haunting, and unresolved. It served as a somber reminder of how fragile our connections can be, how swiftly and unexpectedly someone can slip out of reach, leaving behind nothing but memories and the lingering shadow of their absence. Every evening, as the city quieted down and the sky darkened into a deep velvety blue, an unsettling occurrence began to punctuate the calm in my apartment. It started subtly, with the lights in my living room dimming and then brightening again, as if breathing. At first, I attributed it to the old wiring of the building, a common issue in such an aged structure in the heart of the downtown area. However, the pattern soon became too precise, too consistent to dismiss as mere electrical faults. The phenomenon always began at precisely 9:03 p.m. Whether I was reading a book, watching television, or cleaning up after dinner, the lights would flicker slowly at first, then rapidly, creating a strobe effect that made my heart race. Initially, I joked about it to my friends, suggesting my apartment was haunted by a ghost with punctuality. But laughter soon gave way to genuine concern when another, more chilling element added itself to the nightly disturbance. It was during one of these flickering episodes that I first heard it, the unmistakable sound of faint footsteps in the adjoining room. The steps were soft, cautious, as if someone were trying to move without being noticed. The first time I heard them, I froze, my body tensed in an instinctive response to the unexpected noise. The footsteps seemed to move from one end of the room to the other, then stopped abruptly as the lights ceased their flickering. With a mixture of fear and curiosity, I decided to investigate the occurrences more thoroughly. On a particularly brave evening, armed with a flashlight and a heavy book for protection, I waited for the flickering to begin. Right on schedule, as the clock struck 9:03 p.m. and the lights started their dance, the soft footsteps echoed from the bedroom. I steeled myself and approached the source of the sounds, my hands trembling slightly as I pushed open the bedroom door. The room was empty, bathed in the eerie, oscillating glow of the flickering lights. I scanned every corner, checked under the bed, and even opened the closet, but found nothing. The footsteps had ceased the moment I entered, leaving behind a silence that felt almost oppressive. Frustrated and unnerved, I contacted the building management to inquire about the wiring and to check if other residents had experienced anything similar. The manager assured me that an electrician would inspect the issue, though he seemed skeptical about the footsteps I mentioned. The electrician's visit the next day yielded no answers. He confirmed that the wiring was old but functional, with no apparent faults that could explain the precise timing and bizarre nature of the flickering. His practical suggestions of replacing the bulbs and keeping an eye on the circuit breaker did little to ease my growing anxiety about the nighttime disturbances. Determined to find an explanation, I started researching the history of the building. It turned out that my apartment had a peculiar past, one that the property manager had failed to mention. Decades ago, it had been the site of a mysterious disappearance. A young woman who had lived alone and vanished without a trace one evening, leaving behind only a series of journal entries about strange occurrences in her apartment, much like what I was experiencing. Armed with this new, unsettling information, I approached the nightly phenomena with a new perspective. Perhaps what I was experiencing was not just a series of coincidences, but a lingering echo of the past, a fragment of the previous tenant's unresolved story, manifesting in the flickers and footsteps. From then on, the lights flickered every night, and the soft footsteps wandered through the next room. I never quite got used to the disturbances, but I learned to live with them, treating them as a part of my home's unique character. Sometimes I would even speak softly into the dimly lit rooms, offering words of comfort or an invitation to share the space peacefully. Whether it helped or not, the atmosphere in the apartment lightened slightly, the heavy air of mystery mingling with a sense of historical connection. The flickering lights and the phantom footsteps became my nightly companions, a reminder that some places hold on to their past, replaying it in the quiet moments between the bustle of daily life. In my flickering apartment, the boundary between then and now seemed thinner, and the lights dimmed and brightened like a pulse, beating out a rhythm of a lingering presence, not quite gone, not quite there. When my sister offered me her old baby monitor after she no longer needed it for her toddler, I thought it was a perfect idea to keep tabs on my dog, Benny, while I was at work. The setup was simple: a camera in the corner of the living room, where Benny liked to nap on his plush dog bed, and the receiver next to my bed for easy monitoring. I liked the peace of mind it gave me, being able to check in on him throughout the day, making sure he wasn't getting into mischief. The first few weeks of using the monitor went by without incident. I'd tune in during my lunch breaks to see Benny lazily stretching or occasionally chewing on one of his toys. It was comforting to see him content and safe. However, one night, the routine check on Benny turned into something entirely unexpected and unsettling. It was late, well past midnight, when a faint noise woke me from a light sleep. At first, I thought it might be Benny shifting around, but as my ears tuned in, I realized it was a voice, a soft, whispering voice coming through the baby monitor. It was so low and muffled that I couldn't make out the words at first. Heart pounding, I sat up, straining to listen, trying to discern any discernible words or a sign of where it might be coming from. The voice was eerie, a ghostly murmur that seemed to drift in and out. I got out of bed and approached the monitor, my mind racing with possibilities. Who could it be? Was someone in the house? I checked the video feed. Benny was still there, sound asleep, completely undisturbed by the voice that had sent a chill down my spine. With a growing sense of dread, I searched the entire house. I turned on every light, looked in every room, and checked all the locks. The house was secure, and I was alone, or at least, I appeared to be. Returning to my bedroom, I kept the lights on, sitting up with the monitor in hand, watching and listening intently. The voice didn't return that night, and I eventually fell into an uneasy sleep as the sky began to lighten with the dawn. The next day, my curiosity got the better of my fear. I needed answers. I spent hours researching online, discovering forums and articles about baby monitors picking up frequencies from other devices. The most logical explanation seemed to be interference, perhaps from a neighbor's device or some other source of radio frequency. Yet, that theory didn't entirely ease my mind, nor did it explain why the voice sounded so close, so personal. To address my growing concerns, I reached out to a friend who was knowledgeable about electronics and radio frequencies. We spent an afternoon together, scrutinizing the baby monitor's technology and the possible sources of interference in my neighborhood. My friend explained the basics of how baby monitors can act like radios, picking up signals from other devices if they operate on similar frequencies. We scanned the area, trying to identify any other devices that could be using a similar frequency band, but found nothing conclusive. The exercise was thorough, yet yielded no clear source for the mysterious voice, adding an even deeper layer of mystery to the situation. Determined to get to the bottom of it, I tested the monitor during various times of the day and night, switching frequencies and adjusting settings. For days, nothing out of the ordinary happened. Then, one quiet evening, the whisper returned. This time, I was able to catch a phrase, a simple and chilling, "Don't wake him." This revelation sent a new wave of fear through me. Was it a message meant for someone else, somehow crossing into my monitor? Or was it something more inexplicable, a message meant for me, a warning intertwined with the mundane use of an everyday device. I couldn't tell, and not knowing made it even more terrifying. In the end, I couldn't continue to use the monitor. The fear of hearing that voice again, of not understanding where it came from or what it truly meant, outweighed the convenience of keeping an eye on Benny during my work hours. I switched to a newer, more secure model, ensuring it was encrypted and less likely to pick up external signals. While the new monitor never picked up anything unusual, the memory of the whispering voice lingered long after. It was a stark reminder of how thin the veil might be between the ordinary and the unknown, and how easily the comforts of our daily lives could become conduits to something far beyond our understanding. Late one night, while driving back from a particularly taxing day at work, I found my car's fuel gauge flirting dangerously close to empty. Not wanting to risk getting stranded, I pulled into the only open gas station I could find along the desolate stretch of highway. The fluorescent lights flickered ominously overhead as I pulled up to the pump, casting an eerie glow over the lot. That's when I noticed them, a group of people standing off to the side, just within the edges of the dim light. Their presence was unsettling, more so because of their complete stillness and the uniformity with which they all stared directly at me. There was something deeply unnerving about their silence and the intensity of their gazes. Trying to shake off a growing sense of dread, I got out of the car, kept my head down, and focused on the task of refueling, hoping they were just curious, or perhaps recognizing me as an outsider to their small locality. As the gas pumped, I stole glances at the group. They hadn't moved, their eyes fixed on me, unblinking and unwavering. The air grew thick with tension, and a chill ran down my spine. I finished up quickly, screwing the cap back on with slightly trembling hands. I laughed nervously to myself, trying to dismiss the situation as a product of my tired mind playing tricks on me after a long day. However, the moment I got back into my car, a spike of fear shot through me. They had moved closer, now encircling my vehicle, their faces pressed eerily close to the windows. They were of different ages and appearances, yet shared the same expressionless stare that pierced right through the glass. My heart raced as I locked the doors, the sound echoing loudly in the silent confrontation. None of them knocked on the windows or made any demands. They just stood there, staring. The situation felt surreal, like a scene from a horror movie where the protagonist realizes too late the danger they are in. With a deep breath to steady my shaking hands, I started the engine, the car's interior lights illuminating the figures outside even more grotesquely. They remained motionless, even as I put the car into gear. I glanced in the rear-view mirror, and that's when I saw it. None of their eyes reflected the car's lights. They were like voids, absorbing every photon, enhancing the palpable feeling of otherworldliness. Pushing down a rising panic, I accelerated hard, the tires screeching as I sped out of the gas station. They didn't pursue me, but continued to stand there, watching as I drove away, their silhouettes growing smaller in my rear-view mirror. The drive home was nerve-wracking. Every shadow seemed to move, and every reflective surface hinted at figures lurking just out of sight. When I finally made it home, I was a bundle of frayed nerves. I couldn't shake the image of those vacant, non-reflective eyes and the silent, oppressive atmosphere they had created. The next day, compelled by a mix of fear and curiosity, I called the gas station. The attendant on duty sounded perplexed by my description of the night's events. According to him, there hadn't been any group in the parking lot that night, nor had there been any incidents or gatherings reported recently. I tried to rationalize the experience as a hallucination brought on by stress and fatigue, but the memory of those staring eyes haunted me. I avoided that route thereafter, taking a longer, less direct way to and from work. The image of the strangers at the gas station lingered in my mind, a chilling reminder of the night when the ordinary turned ominous, leaving me with unanswered questions, and a deep, lingering unease about what might lurk just out of sight in the dead of night. Living on the edge of the woods always had its eerie moments, but nothing had ever unnerved me as much as the two glowing eyes that began appearing each night. It started subtly, a fleeting glimpse of luminescence that I'd brushed off as the reflection of an animal's eyes caught in the light from my house. But night after night, the eyes were there, staring from the same spot amidst the thick trees, their unwavering gaze fixed directly on my back porch. Each evening, as dusk fell, and the woods grew thick with shadows, the eyes would emerge. They glowed with an unnatural intensity, two orbs of light in the otherwise impenetrable darkness of the forest. They never moved, never blinked, just watched silently from the darkness. The sight sent shivers down my spine, the feeling of being watched by something unseen, something patient and persistent. For weeks, I tried to ignore them, pulling the curtains tight and avoiding looking out into the woods at night. But the curiosity and fear gnawed at me, an incessant whisper that urged me to find out what was watching me. One night, my fear and frustration peaked, and I grabbed a flashlight, determined to confront whatever lurked beyond the edge of my yard. Steeling my nerves, I walked slowly towards the woods, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the night. As I approached the spot where I had seen the eyes, my heart pounded loudly in my chest, each step forward a battle against my instinct to run away. The light flickered through the branches, shadows dancing wildly around me, each twist of darkness making me jump. But as I reached the place where the eyes had been, they suddenly vanished. I swept the flashlight back and forth, searching through the trees, expecting at any moment to uncover the source of those haunting eyes. But there was nothing, just the usual rustle of leaves and the distant call of nocturnal animals. The forest seemed utterly ordinary, and I felt a mix of relief and frustration wash over me. Determined not to leave without an answer, I ventured deeper, my flashlight probing the dark recesses between the trees. Every snap of a twig underfoot sounded alarmingly loud, and the natural noises of the forest seemed amplified, each rustle and whisper a potential threat. Yet, no matter how far I searched or how thoroughly I investigated, the eyes did not reappear, and no creature emerged to explain what I had seen. As I walked back, the forest's natural chorus gradually resumed, with crickets chirping and an owl hooting in the distance, as if the woods themselves were shaking off the disturbance of my intrusion. My footsteps echoed softly on the leaf-strewn path, the sound somehow reassuring after the intense silence that had accompanied my search. The familiar sights of the forest, with moonlight filtering through the branches, gave the night a less ominous feel, replacing some of my fear with the usual awe of nature's nocturnal beauty. However, a part of me couldn't let go of the eerie encounter so easily. The eyes had been too vivid, too precise in their location and gaze to be a mere trick of light or a fleeting illusion. This thought kept replaying in my mind as I neared the safety of my home, the shadow of the trees casting long dark figures across my path, reminding me that many secrets lay hidden in the depths of the dark woods, secrets not meant to be disturbed. Feeling foolish and slightly unnerved, I returned to my house, the woods falling silent behind me. In the safety of my home, I pondered the experience. Had my mind played tricks on me? Or had something been watching me, retreating into the safety of the darkness when confronted? The eyes did not appear again after that night. Perhaps my venture into the woods had scared off whatever creature had been watching, or maybe it had simply moved on to a less curious target. Though I was relieved, the mystery of those glowing eyes lingered. The woods behind my house seemed darker, more secretive, a reminder of the unknowns that lay just beyond the familiar safety of our everyday surroundings. As the days turned into weeks and no further sign of the glowing eyes emerged, I began to relax a bit. Yet, every night as I locked up my house and turned off the lights, I couldn't help but glance towards the woods, a part of me still searching the darkness, wondering about the eyes in the dark, and the secrets that the forest kept hidden just out of sight. The whispers began subtly, almost imperceptibly, like a thread of sound woven into the fabric of everyday noises in my apartment. At first, I thought it might be the murmur of neighbours' voices, carried through thin walls or open windows. However, as the days passed, the whispers grew more distinct, a soft, sibilant chorus that seemed to seep through the very air. It was unsettling, the way they seemed to follow me from room to room, always just on the edge of comprehension. Initially, I tried to ignore the whispers, dismissing them as a product of stress or lack of sleep. But their persistent presence gnawed at me, pushing me to seek out the source. It was during a quiet evening, as I sat reading, that I realized the sound was strongest near the air vents. Placing my ear against the vent, the whispers intensified, as though a group of unseen speakers were right on the other side, their voices intermingling in a ghostly dialogue. Confused and more than a little frightened, I decided to turn off the entire air system, hoping that the cessation of airflow might halt the disturbing phenomenon. The apartment fell silent, the hum of the machinery winding down, but the effect on the whispering was the opposite of what I had hoped. Without the background noise of the air system, the whispers grew clearer, more insistent. They seemed to echo in the stillness of the apartment, particularly at night when the world quieted down. The whispering at night began to affect my sleep deeply. The voices seemed almost to be calling out to me, their tones plaintive and persistent. Desperate for answers, I contacted the building maintenance to check the vents for any possible explanation, animal nests, or perhaps a malfunction of the air system that could be carrying sound from other apartments. The maintenance team came and went, finding nothing out of the ordinary, their puzzled looks adding to my frustration and fear. Unsatisfied and unable to accept that nothing was causing the mysterious sounds, I decided to take a closer look myself. I unscrewed the vent grill and peered inside with a flashlight. The duct was just a dark, empty tunnel, extending farther than my light could reach. On a whim, I decided to record the sounds, placing a digital recorder by the vent overnight. Listening to the recording the next morning, I heard the same eerie whispering, but this time, amidst the unintelligible murmurings, I caught something new, a distinct phrase repeated several times, below and within. The phrase chilled me to the bone, and I found myself unable to shake the feeling that these words held a meaning I couldn't yet understand. Driven by a mix of fear and determination, I reached out to a friend who had a keen interest in the supernatural. He was intrigued by the recording and suggested we conduct a more thorough investigation using specialized audio equipment. We spent several nights capturing and analyzing the sounds, and while many of the whispers remained muddled, a few more phrases began to emerge, some making references to hidden things and forgotten stories. The investigation took us deeper into the history of the building. We discovered that the apartment complex had been built over the site of an old mansion, known for its eccentric owner who, according to local lore, was rumoured to have hidden rooms and passageways in his home. This revelation cast the whispers in a new light, suggesting they might be echoes of the past, remnants of the mansion's hidden legacies murmuring through the vents. Though the whispers never fully ceased, my fear gradually gave way to a profound curiosity about the history beneath my home. The voices in the vents, once a source of nightly terror, became for me a whispering gallery, telling tales of the old mansion's secrets, their words a bridge from the forgotten past to my present. While I couldn't decipher all their messages, I learned to live with the mystery, listening with a respectful awe to the voices that spoke of times and tales beyond my understanding. Moving in with a new roommate always carries a blend of excitement and anxiety, especially when you meet them through an online listing. You hope for the best: compatibility, respect, maybe even a new friend. My new roommate, Alex, seemed ideal at first. Friendly but private, clean, and mostly quiet, they seemed like the perfect match. But as the weeks passed, a few peculiar habits began to emerge, particularly their insistence on keeping their bedroom door locked at all times. At first, I dismissed this behavior as a quirk of someone valuing their privacy, perhaps more than most. However, as time went on, the constant sound of the key turning in the lock, even when Alex was inside, began to stir a curiosity in me that I couldn't shake off. It was a small thing, but it nagged at me, the way mysteries often do when they live so close to you. One night, the opportunity to learn more presented itself, though entirely by accident. Alex had mentioned they would be out for the evening with friends, which gave me the apartment to myself, a rarity that I cherished. While doing a bit of cleaning, I bumped into Alex's door with the vacuum cleaner. To my surprise, the door didn't hold. It creaked open slightly. It was odd, considering how diligently Alex locked it. Driven by a mixture of concern and curiosity, I pushed the door open. The sight that greeted me was unsettling. The walls of Alex's room were plastered with photos. But they weren't just any photos, they were all of me. There were pictures from before we met, which chilled me to the bone. Photos from social events, candid shots taken from distances, and even pictures of me in this very apartment. It was as if my entire recent history had been documented and displayed on these walls. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I took in the sheer extent of the collection. Photos were annotated with dates, times, and occasionally comments on what I was doing or wearing. The meticulous nature of this shrine was disturbingly obsessive, far beyond the behavior of a simple roommate curiosity. This was invasive, a violation of privacy I hadn't imagined possible in my mundane daily life. I left the room, careful to leave everything as I had found it, and shut the door with a soft click that seemed to echo through my now dizzy mind. The rest of the night I spent restless, jumping at every sound, unsure how to confront Alex or protect myself. My trust was shattered, replaced by a paranoia that someone I lived with harbored an unsettling fixation on me. During those tense hours waiting for dawn, I scoured the internet for advice on how to handle such a delicate and potentially dangerous situation. Legal forums and personal safety blogs suggested documenting everything, contacting law enforcement, and securing a restraining order if necessary. Yet, I felt overwhelmed by the thought of escalating things legally, especially with no tangible proof other than the photos that could be explained away as a bizarre but harmless hobby. My main goal became to remove myself from the immediate threat quietly, to find safety first, and then consider my next moves from a secure distance. The decision to leave without confrontation weighed heavily on me, a mix of relief and unresolved tension. As I sat in my friend's guest room that night, I couldn't help but replay the discovery over and over in my mind, wondering about the signs I might have missed, the casual conversations that might have held hidden meanings. The sense of betrayal was profound, turning every memory of the past weeks into a question mark, every shared moment now tinted with suspicion and fear. When Alex returned, I feigned sleep, my mind racing with plans and possibilities. The next morning, after Alex had left for work, I packed a few essentials and left the apartment. I contacted the landlord with a fabricated excuse for breaking the lease and stayed with a friend while I looked for a new place to live. I debated confronting Alex or reporting them to the authorities, but was torn by the fear of escalating the situation. Instead, I chose safety and distance, leaving behind questions that might never have satisfying answers. The experience left me wary, a reminder of how little we might know those who share our living spaces. From then on, I insisted on more thorough vetting of potential roommates, keenly aware that normalcy is often only the surface of deeper, darker currents. The evening was just beginning to cool as I left the office later than usual, the setting sun casting long shadows down the bustling city streets. I was weaving through the usual crowd of commuters when a voice cut through the low hum of noise, calling my name. Startled, I turned towards the sound, expecting to see a familiar face, a coworker or an old friend perhaps. Instead, I was met with the gaze of a complete stranger, a man with an unreadable expression and eyes that seemed oddly intense. He was dressed unremarkably, blending into the crowd except for that fixed stare and the unsettling smile that spread across his face as our eyes met. "Anna," he said again, as if to confirm to himself that he had found who he was looking for. Confusion swept over me, and I stopped in my tracks. "I'm sorry, do I know you?" I asked, my voice tinged with cautious curiosity. His smile widened just a fraction, and without another word, he turned and disappeared into the moving throng of people. The brief encounter left me rattled, my heart racing as I tried to place his face. But he was a stranger to me, completely unfamiliar despite the obvious recognition he had of my name. Shaking off the uneasy feeling, I continued my walk home, attributing the incident to perhaps a case of mistaken identity or a misplaced acquaintance whose face I couldn't recall. However, the strangeness of the day didn't end there. Later that night, as I was winding down, my phone buzzed with a new message from an unknown number. "It was nice seeing you again," it read. Chills ran down my spine. The message was too coincidental, too targeted to be a simple prank. It was clear this person not only knew my name, but had also somehow obtained my phone number. Fearing that ignoring the message might escalate the situation, I replied, "Who is this?" Minutes passed, each one stretching with tension, but no response came. I tried calling the number, only to be met with an automated message informing me that the number had been disconnected. This impossibility only deepened my concern, turning the day's oddities into a night of paranoia. Despite the police's assurances and my efforts to stay vigilant, the unsettling feeling of being watched lingered. Each time my phone buzzed or a shadow passed by my window, my heart skipped a beat, the fear of seeing that unknown number, or worse, that stranger, returning in full force. I began documenting everything, from the times I received any unusual messages to noting down descriptions of strangers who seemed overly interested or out of place. This meticulous record-keeping became both a shield and a burden, a constant reminder of my vulnerability. As days turned into weeks with no further strange occurrences, the tension slowly began to ease, though it never fully disappeared. I found myself double-checking locks and looking over my shoulder more often than before. Friends noticed the change in my demeanor and tried to offer comfort, suggesting perhaps it was all just a bizarre coincidence or a wrong number. But the precision of the stranger's knowledge, my name, my presence at that specific location, and then my personal contact left little room for such dismissals in my mind. Sleep was elusive that night. My mind raced with possibilities. Had I somehow been targeted by someone I had offended unknowingly, or was there a deeper, more sinister explanation? The next day, I filed a report with the local police, explaining the situation. They took down the details, and advised me to keep a record of any further communications, promising to monitor any potential threats. In the following days, I changed my daily routines, opting for different routes home and constantly looking over my shoulder. I informed my friends and family about the incident, ensuring someone always knew my whereabouts. The anxiety of being watched or followed persisted, casting a shadow over my daily life. As weeks passed without further incident, the initial fear gradually began to fade, replaced by a vigilant caution. I remained alert, always aware of my surroundings and the people around me. The stranger's identity and his intentions remained a mystery, a disconcerting enigma that occasionally whispered in the back of my mind. Reflecting on the incident, I couldn't help but feel a deep violation of my privacy and safety, a reminder of how quickly normalcy can be disrupted by the unknown. Whether it was a mistaken identity, a misplaced acquaintance, or something more deliberate, the encounter was a stark lesson in personal security and the unpredictable nature of everyday interactions. Living alone comes with its own set of perks and challenges. The tranquility that usually enveloped my apartment was a significant upside, allowing me moments of peace after long days. However, that solitude was shattered one night, turning my haven into a scene straight out of a suspense thriller. It started when I was awakened by the distinct sound of water running. Groggy and disoriented, I glanced at the clock, noting it was just past midnight. The rhythmic sound of the shower was unmistakable, and my heart raced with the sudden realization that it should not have been on. I live alone after all. No one else should have been there to turn it on. Summoning my courage, I crept out of bed and tiptoed toward the bathroom. The door was slightly ajar, emitting a thin stream of steam into the dimly lit hallway. I paused, listening for any sounds of movement, but heard only the dripping of water that had recently been shut off. I pushed the door open fully and was greeted by a wall of warm, moist air. The bathroom was filled with steam, clouding the room and fogging up the mirror, yet the shower was off, the curtain pulled back neatly as I always left it. With a sense of unease, I approached the mirror, my movements slow and cautious. I reached out to wipe away the condensation, needing to see my own reflection to reassure myself I was indeed alone. As my hand moved across the mirror, clearing a swath through the mist, I caught a glimpse of movement behind me, a figure, indistinct and shadowy, moving silently behind me through the steam. I whipped around, heart hammering in my chest, but the bathroom was empty. The lingering steam swirled around me, the only movement in an otherwise still room. Shaken, I hurriedly searched the entire apartment, checking every possible hiding place and ensuring all doors and windows were securely locked. Everything was in order, and there were no signs of forced entry. Yet the unshakable feeling of having seen someone, if only for a fleeting moment, made me question my own senses. The apartment felt different now, as if the air itself had thickened, charged with an unseen presence. The unsettling experience prompted me to take additional precautions. I started double-checking the locks each night and kept a flashlight and baseball bat near my bed. The sense of security that my apartment once offered had been deeply shaken, and each shadow or odd noise now carried a hint of threat. I found myself jumping at the smallest sounds, a testament to how deeply the incident had affected me. Sleep became a fitful affair, with me waking several times a night to the slightest noise, my first thought always racing to the empty, fog-filled bathroom. Feeling isolated in my experience, I reached out to neighbours, tentatively asking if they had ever noticed anything unusual in their own apartments. None reported anything out of the ordinary, which only deepened my sense of confusion and isolation. Conversations with them, however, did offer a sliver of comfort, The community aspect of apartment living provided a small buffer against the fear. Despite this, the vivid image of the shadowy figure in the steam lingered in my mind, an unresolved mystery that continued to disturb my peace. Unable to sleep, I spent the rest of the night in the living room, lights ablaze and every noise making me jump. The following day, drained and still on edge, I contacted the building management to inquire about any recent issues with the plumbing that might explain the phantom shower. They assured me there had been no reports of any malfunctions or similar experiences from other tenants. Determined to find a rational explanation, I considered the possibility of hallucinations brought on by sleep deprivation or stress. However, the vividness of what I had seen was hard to dismiss. The memory of that fleeting figure in the mirror haunted me, prompting me to install a small camera in the bathroom, half in desperation and half in defiance of my own creeping dread. Night after night, the camera recorded nothing unusual, and slowly, my life returned to its normal rhythm. Yet the comfort of routine couldn't entirely erase the chilling memory or the constant, niggling thought that what I saw that night was real. It lingered in the back of my mind, a whisper of fear that flared with every unexpected shadow or unexplained noise, a stark reminder of the night when something or someone was in the shower with me, unseen but unsettlingly present. Finding the perfect rental can be a daunting task, particularly in a city where good deals disappear faster than they appear. So when I stumbled upon a listing for a quaint house that boasted a generous layout, modern amenities, and surprisingly, a rental price well within my budget, I was immediately intrigued. The photos showed a beautifully maintained property with lush gardens and a welcoming, sun-drenched porch. It seemed ideal, and I wasted no time contacting the landlord to schedule a viewing. The landlord, Mr. Harper, responded promptly, providing me with the address and a time for the viewing later that week. He was enthusiastic on the phone, assuring me that I would love the place. He described the recent renovations and the quiet neighborhood, which he said was a friendly and close-knit community. Everything seemed to be falling into place perfectly, which, in my experience, was rare in the competitive city housing market. On the day of the viewing, I drove to the address Mr. Harper had given me. However, as I arrived at the street, confusion set in. I drove slowly, looking for the house number, but instead of the charming residence I had seen in the photos, there was only an overgrown vacant lot sandwiched between two modern apartment buildings. Thinking perhaps there was a mistake, I checked the address again, matching it with what Mr. Harper had sent. It was definitely the right place, yet there was no house to be seen. Feeling a mix of confusion and disappointment, I parked my car and walked around, thinking maybe the house was hidden behind overgrowth, or perhaps I had misunderstood the directions. But no matter how much I hoped to find something that resembled the listing, the reality was undeniable. The house simply wasn't there. I decided to give Mr. Harper a call, assuming there had been some error. When he answered, his tone was as warm and welcoming as before. I explained the situation, describing the empty lot and my inability to locate the house. There was a pause on the line, then he chuckled lightly, as if I had shared a particularly mild joke. "Oh, the house is definitely there," he insisted. "You might be confused by the overgrowth. It can get a bit wild if I don't send someone to tend to it regularly. But rest assured, the house is there, and I assure you, it's just as beautiful as in the photos." Perplexed, I asked him about the current tenants he had mentioned, hoping to contact them or at least confirm their existence. Again, Mr. Harper assured me that a family was indeed living there and that they loved the property. He described the tenants, a young couple with a small child, and their satisfaction with the rental, which only deepened the mystery. Determined to get to the bottom of this, I hung up and knocked on the doors of the neighbouring apartment buildings. Perhaps they could provide some insight or verify my growing suspicion that something was amiss. The residents were friendly but equally confused by my questions. They confirmed that the lot had been empty for years, ever since the old house that once stood there had been demolished. No one had seen any construction or signs of habitation on the lot since. Returning to the lot, I stood there, feeling a mix of frustration and intrigue. How could Mr. Harper insist the house existed? Was it a scam? But what would he gain from it, especially when the truth was so blatantly obvious to anyone who took the time to visit? Later that night, unable to let go of the mystery, I conducted some online research on the property. To my surprise, the address was associated with an unsolved mystery dating back several years. A disappearance case involving a previous tenant of the house that once stood on the now empty lot. According to old news reports, the tenant had vanished without a trace, leaving all their belongings behind in the house that was later demolished. The case had gone cold, and theories abounded, from foul play to supernatural explanations. The chilling history of the lot only added layers to the puzzle. Was Mr. Harper using the listing as a bizarre way to draw attention to an unsolved mystery? Or was he somehow unaware of the true state of the property? With no answers, only more questions, I decided to step back from the situation, alerting local authorities about the strange listing and Mr. Harper's claims. The house with no address remained a mystery, an enigma wrapped in the urban legends of the city. A story of a house that was, and then wasn't, existing now only in photographs, and the adamant assurances of a landlord who seemed as spectral as the dwelling he claimed was still there. The tapping started about a week after I moved into the second-floor apartment. At first, I thought it might be a tree limb brushing against the window, common enough on windy nights. But the regularity of the sound, always 3 sharp taps, repeated several times throughout the night, soon dispelled that theory. The precision unnerved me. It didn't seem natural. Each night as darkness fell, the tapping would begin, disturbing my peace as I tried to unwind from the day's activities. Living alone, sounds in the night took on a magnified significance, each one a reminder of my solitude. After several nights of disturbed sleep, my curiosity mingled with fear. There were no trees near the window, and from my vantage point, there was no ledge or balcony outside, nothing that could explain the presence of someone at my window. One evening, determined to confront whatever or whoever was causing the disturbance, I waited by the window, my heart pounding in anticipation. The room was silent, save for the occasional car passing on the street below. Then, as expected, the tapping began. It was louder, more insistent than I remembered. With a deep breath, I yanked the curtain aside, my movements swift, powered by a mix of adrenaline and fear. There, pressed against the glass, was a hand, a pale human hand. It was so clear, so close, I could see the lines crisscrossing its palm, and the slight tremble of the fingers. I stumbled back, a scream caught in my throat. There was no balcony outside, no way for anyone to be there. Yet, the hand was unmistakable. I blinked, and when my eyes opened again, the hand was gone as if it had never been there. Shaking, I opened the window to peer outside, half expecting to find someone clinging to the side of the building. But there was nothing, just the empty night and a 2-story drop to the ground below. Sleep became impossible after that. The image of the hand haunted me, its presence inexplicable and terrifying. I began to research the building's history, hoping for an explanation. My search led me to a startling discovery. Decades earlier, the building had been the site of a tragic accident where a construction worker had fallen to his death from the very window of my apartment. The details were chilling, and I couldn't help but wonder if what I'd seen was a remnant of that long-ago tragedy. Not knowing who else to turn to, I contacted a local group that specialized in paranormal investigations. They were intrigued by my story and agreed to spend a night in the apartment to observe and record any unusual activity. That night, their equipment picked up unusual temperature fluctuations and electromagnetic readings by the window at the exact times the tapping occurred, though the hand did not appear again. The paranormal investigators set up their equipment meticulously, spreading sensors and cameras that covered every angle of my bedroom, particularly focusing on the window where the incidents occurred. As the sun set and darkness cloaked the room, a palpable tension filled the air, almost as if the apartment itself was bracing for the nocturnal visitation. We sat in the dim light of the monitors, watching the digital numbers flicker and listening to the static hum of the audio equipment. Time seemed to stretch on indefinitely, each minute thick with anticipation and the echo of my own accelerated heartbeat. Around the usual time the tapping began, the temperature near the window dropped suddenly, a stark contrast to the warmth of the rest of the room. The investigators whispered excitedly among themselves, their eyes fixed on the thermal imaging display that now showed a distinct cold spot floating eerily by the window pane. Despite the clear readings and the drop in temperature, the night was markedly quiet. No tapping disturbed the silence. Though slightly disappointed, the investigators assured me that the environmental changes were significant, anomalies that couldn't be easily explained by drafts or other natural occurrences in the structure of the building. The investigators suggested that the phenomenon might be a residual haunting, an imprint left behind by the intense emotions or energy at the time of the worker's death. They believed it was harmless, a replay of a moment lost in time, but knowing this did little to ease my unease. I struggled with the decision to move, torn between the fear of experiencing further disturbances and the hassle of finding a new place. Ultimately, the decision was made for me when a job opportunity arose in another city. I left the apartment, relieved to put distance between myself and the tapping. The old television set had been a hand-me-down from my grandparents, a bulky, boxy relic from a bygone era that somehow still functioned, albeit with its quirks. For the most part, it served its purpose well enough, offering a comforting background noise as I worked late into the night. However, about a month ago, something peculiar began to occur, exclusively on Channel 42. At first, it was just static that would disrupt the late-night talk shows. The sudden fizzling and crackling of the screen were jarring, but I chalked it up to a poor signal. A plausible explanation in my old apartment building with its equally aged wiring. However, as days turned into weeks, the static interruptions became more frequent and began to carry an eerie addition. Whispers. It started so faintly that I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, weary from work. But night after night, the whispers grew louder, clearer, and undeniably real. They were hushed, as though a group of people were quietly discussing something just out of sight. More disturbingly, I began to catch my name among the murmured words, followed by snippets of sentences that felt chillingly personal and accusatory. Driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, I started recording the audio during these episodes, hoping to capture and perhaps make sense of the whispers. The recordings were unsettling. The voices didn't seem to be random. They were conversational, discussing events from my day, my fears, my secrets, things no stranger could possibly know. It felt as if invisible spectators were watching me, talking about me as if I were a character in their show. Then, one night, the phenomenon escalated terrifyingly. The screen was overtaken by an intense burst of static, as I was about to turn off the TV and head to bed. This time, the static began to coalesce into a form on the screen. At first, it was amorphous, just shades of grey shifting against the black. But gradually, it took on a distinct shape, a face. The features were blurred and constantly shifting, yet the eyes were unmistakable. They were piercingly clear and seemed to stare directly at me, full of an intelligence and intent that froze me in place. The face didn't speak, but the whispers continued, now louder than ever, swirling around me in the dimly lit room. I stood there, rooted to the spot, unable to look away from the spectral face that seemed so keenly focused on me. The whispers grew to a crescendo, then abruptly stopped. The face dissolved back into ordinary static, and the screen returned to normal, as if nothing had happened. Sleep was impossible after that. The next day, drained and desperate for answers, I reached out to a local expert in paranormal phenomena, sharing the recordings and describing the face and the static. The expert was intrigued and concerned, suggesting that the television might be acting as a sort of conduit or receiver for energies or entities unknown. He advised me to discontinue using the TV and arranged to visit and investigate the phenomenon further. His investigation brought more questions than answers. He detected abnormal electromagnetic fields around the old set and speculated that it could be interacting with a specific type of energy or presence in my apartment, possibly tied to its past or to the land it was built on. The history of the area, as he discovered, included several unexplained phenomena reported over the decades, adding a layer of historical mystery to my unsettling experience. Following his advice, I stopped using the television and eventually removed it from my apartment. The whispers and the face did not appear again, but the impact of the experience lingered. I was left with a profound sense of unease, a feeling that I had glimpsed something otherworldly, a reminder that some mysteries are perhaps better left unexplored. The static had broken its normal boundaries, blurring the lines between technology and the paranormal, between the known and the unknowable. It was a typical evening as I left the local convenience store, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink as the sun dipped below the horizon. The walk home was a path I had tread countless times, a familiar route through a quiet residential area that usually offered a comforting, mundane end to my day. However, this particular evening was different. As I strolled along, lost in thought about the mundane details of my daily life, I suddenly felt a chill run down my spine, snapping me out of my reverie. I glanced at my watch and was startled to see that an hour had passed, an entire hour that I couldn't account for. Looking around, I realized I was still a few blocks from home, standing on a sidewalk I didn't recognize, far from my usual route. My confusion deepened when I noticed my shoes and the lower parts of my trousers were splattered with mud. It had been a dry week, and the streets and sidewalks were clean. Perplexed, I tried to trace back my steps in my mind, but there was a blank, a void where my memory should have been. It was as if I had been walking on autopilot, only to wake up in the middle of a scene from someone else's life. Feeling a creeping unease, I hurried home, glancing over my shoulder frequently. The sensation of being watched was palpable, causing the hairs on the back of my neck to stand on end. When I finally reached my house, I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, trying to catch my breath and make sense of the inexplicable lost hour. The following days were filled with growing anxiety. I examined my clothes from that night, my belongings, and even retraced my steps, but nothing made sense. The route I must have taken led through a part of the neighborhood characterized by old, overgrown lots and abandoned projects, places I would never have ventured through voluntarily, especially not at dusk. The strangest part was the mud, which I eventually traced back to a small neglected park known for its marshy grounds, a detour that was both illogical and out of character. Determined to understand what had happened, I consulted a doctor about the possibility of a transient amnesic episode, but the tests came back normal. With medical explanations ruled out, my thoughts turned to more unsettling possibilities. Had I been followed, perhaps led astray, or worse, taken somewhere against my will? The lack of physical harm or any other evidence of an encounter didn't ease my concerns. It only deepened the mystery. Unable to let it go, I installed a GPS app on my phone to track my movements, a decision that was soon validated. A week later, the same sensation of lost time happened again. This time, the app showed a meandering path through various back streets before returning to normalcy. The route was erratic, without purpose, mirroring the confusion of my own thoughts. Armed with this new information, I went to the police. They were skeptical, but agreed to patrol the area and advised me to stay alert. I also reached out to the community, discovering in the process a few others who had experienced similar episodes of missing time. Our stories were disturbingly similar, each involving unexplained detours and sensations of being led by an unseen force. Together, we organized watches and set up more comprehensive surveillance around the areas where the incidents occurred. It wasn't long before a pattern emerged, centering around the old, marshy park. The police increased their scrutiny and eventually uncovered signs of clandestine activity in the area, including evidence of temporary encampments and surveillance equipment hidden in the foliage. The discovery led to more questions than answers. Who was watching us and why? The investigation continued, unraveling layers of complexity involving illegal surveillance and experimental tactics by a group with unknown motives. As the authorities dug deeper, I felt a mixture of relief and horror. Relief that the mystery was being taken seriously, and horror at the implications of what had been happening to us. The incidents of missing time never recurred after the group was dismantled. Yet, the memory of those lost hours, the mud on my shoes, and the eerie feeling of being followed lingered long after, a reminder of how quickly normalcy can be disrupted and the thin veil between safety and danger in our everyday lives. The move into the new apartment was supposed to be a fresh start, a clean slate in a quieter part of town. The building was older, brimming with character, and the kind of craftsmanship you don't see in newer constructions. My unit was on the top floor, with a pleasant view of the bustling street below. Everything about it seemed perfect, even serendipitous, given the stressful weeks I'd spent apartment hunting. As I unpacked, I decided to make use of every nook and cranny the old place offered, including an oddly placed closet in the corner of the bedroom. It was there, behind a loose panel at the back of this closet, that I found a small leather-bound journal. Curiosity piqued, I opened it, discovering it was filled with meticulous entries penned in a tight, precise hand. The earliest entries were innocuous enough, detailing mundane aspects of daily life. But as I flipped through the pages, I realized the writings chronicled the life of a previous tenant. The detail was remarkable, bordering on obsessive. Entries noted everything from times of leaving and returning to the apartment, to lists of visitors, and even descriptions of meals eaten and clothes worn. Initially, I found it amusing, a quirky find that made for an interesting read. But as I delved deeper into the journal, the entries began to shift in tone and content. The benign observations grew more intense, more invasive. It was unsettling, but nothing prepared me for the entries that came next. To my shock, the most recent entries began to describe me. The details were accurate: my move-in date, the colour of the moving boxes, the late-night takeout I'd ordered my first evening there, and even the movie I watched on my laptop that night. Each new entry echoed my days with chilling accuracy, as if the author was surveilling me in real time. The realization that I was being watched, and that the watcher had access to my apartment, sent a wave of dread washing over me. I scoured the apartment, searching for any signs of hidden cameras or other surveillance equipment, but found nothing. Paranoia crept into every moment I spent inside the apartment. I kept the curtains tightly drawn and jumped at every sound. Determined to uncover the identity of my watcher, I took the journal to the police. They were skeptical, but agreed to investigate given the detailed nature of the entries. The officers asked neighbours about the previous tenants and started monitoring the area for any suspicious activity. Meanwhile, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me every time I entered or left the apartment. The breakthrough came when one of my neighbours, an elderly lady who had lived in the building for decades, recognized the handwriting in the journal. It belonged to a man who had lived in my apartment years before, a reclusive individual who had suddenly moved out after a brief, intense relationship that had ended badly. The police were able to track him down, discovering that he had kept keys to several former residences and had a history of stalking behaviour. The man was arrested, and a search of his current residence turned up surveillance equipment and multiple journals like mine, detailing the lives of others he had watched over the years. It was a deeply unsettling revelation, but one that brought me a sense of relief. The entries about me ceased, and slowly the apartment began to feel like mine again. However, the experience left a lasting imprint on me. I became more cautious, more aware of my surroundings. The journal, once a curious find, had opened a window into a stranger's obsession, reminding me of the fragile boundaries between privacy and intrusion. Though the physical watching had stopped, the psychological impact lingered, colouring my days with a wariness that took months to fade. Living in a quiet suburban neighbourhood has its perks: community events, familiar faces, and a general sense of security and belonging. When I moved in, I was greeted warmly by everyone on the street, but one neighbour in particular stood out, Mr. Thompson, who lived next door. He was an elderly man, always tending to his garden or sitting on his porch with a friendly wave for passers-by. We often chatted about the weather, local news, or his garden tips. It was comforting to have such a neighbourly presence next door. However, over the course of several months, I began to notice that Mr. Thompson was no longer sitting out on his porch during the usual hours. His garden started to look overgrown, and the curtains were always drawn. It struck me as odd, but I assumed perhaps he was on vacation or maybe visiting family. Yet, weeks turned into a month, and there was still no sign of him. Concerned, I decided to check on him, knocking on his door one afternoon. There was no answer, but what was more disturbing was the thick layer of dust on the doorknob and the stack of uncollected mail on the porch, signs that no one had been in or out for quite some time. Worried, I reached out to other neighbours and was taken aback by their reactions. Not only did they not know where Mr. Thompson had gone, they didn't remember him at all. It was as if overnight everyone's memories of him had vanished, except for mine. I received confused looks when I mentioned his name. Neighbours glanced at the seemingly abandoned house and shrugged, suggesting perhaps I was mistaken or confusing him with someone else. Determined to find some answers, I turned to the internet, searching property records, social media, anything that could prove Mr. Thompson existed. But it was as if he had been erased from existence. No records, no social media presence, not even a mention in the local community newsletters. It was utterly baffling and increasingly unsettling. Driven by a mix of curiosity and growing anxiety, I decided to break into Mr. Thompson's house to look for any clues that might explain his sudden disappearance, or at least prove he was real. The inside of the house looked just as abandoned as the outside. Dust covered everything, and there was an oppressive feel of neglect. It seemed untouched, yet eerily pristine, as if it had been deliberately set to look uninhabited. In his living room, I found a collection of photographs on the mantel. There were pictures of Mr. Thompson with various people, smiling and enjoying various outings. As I flipped through the photos, I noticed that none of the faces were recognizable, not from the neighborhood or any local groups I knew of. It struck me then how little I actually knew about him, his past, or his connections outside our brief interactions. My search led me to his study, where I found a journal. It was filled with entries that echoed the loneliness of a man who felt increasingly detached from the world around him. The last entry was dated shortly before he disappeared and spoke of a growing sense that he was being forgotten, as if his very existence was fading. Chilled to the bone, I left the house with the journal, more questions swirling in my head than answers. The experience haunted me, the feeling of walking through a home that seemed like a stage set up to look lived in, while the world outside denied its occupant's existence. I took the issue to the police, but without evidence of a crime. Their hands were tied. They suggested maybe he had moved away quietly, but nothing explained the collective amnesia of my neighbours, or the lack of any official records. The mystery of Mr. Thompson lingered long after. Sometimes I would stand between our houses at dusk, half expecting to see him there, tending to his roses or waving from his porch, back from wherever he had gone, or, perhaps, from never having been gone at all. The line between reality and my memories blurred, and I began to wonder if I too would slowly fade from this world, a ghost in my own life, remembered by none. It was late, much later than I usually stayed up, but insomnia had gripped me tightly that evening. Deciding a warm wash might help soothe my restless mind, I trudged to the bathroom, my movements sluggish, the weight of another sleepless night settling in. The dim light flickered as I turned on the tap, the sound of rushing water echoing slightly in the compact space of my small apartment's bathroom. Leaning over the sink, I splashed warm water on my face, the heat a welcome contrast against the cool, stagnant air. It was when I reached for my towel and straightened up to glance in the mirror that I froze. The face staring back at me was undoubtedly mine. Same hazel eyes, same freckles, scattered like a sparse constellation across the nose. But something was horribly off. As I wiped my face, I kept my eyes on my reflection, or rather, on what should have been my reflection. I stopped moving, but the figure in the mirror continued, finishing its own set of motions, ending with a patry of the face and a slow, deliberate smile. A smile that never graced my lips. Panic rooted me to the spot, my heart pounding so fiercely I could hear it in my ears over the sound of the still running tap. The smile on the figure's face widened, its eyes twinkling with a mix of mischief and something darker. "Stop it," I whispered, my voice a mix of fear and disbelief. "This isn't real." But as if in response, the figure in the mirror cocked its head, its smile morphing into a grin, showing teeth that seemed too sharp, too gleaming to belong to me. I reached out a trembling hand towards the mirror, half expecting to feel warmth, a pulse, something living. But my fingers met only the cold, hard glass, sending a shiver down my spine. The figure did the same, its fingertips aligning perfectly with mine, yet there was no sensation of touch, only the cold barrier of the mirror between us. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure's lips moved, and though no sound came through, I could read the single word it formed, you. I recoiled as if struck, stumbling backwards into the wall. The figure watched me with an eerie calmness, its eyes following every move I made. It was then I noticed other subtle differences. The clothes it wore weren't mine, and there was a scar on its cheek that I didn't have. It was me, but not me at the same time, a doppelganger trapped within the glass. Rushing out of the bathroom, I slammed the door behind me, my breathing shallow and ragged. I spent the rest of the night in the living room, the lights blazing, too terrified to go back into the bathroom. When morning finally came, bringing with it the rational light of day, I ventured back, my resolve fortified by daylight. In the following days, my mind wrestled with the reality of what I had experienced. Despite the normalcy that daylight brought, the night's events were etched deeply in my memory, turning every shadow into a lurking fear. I began researching phenomena similar to my own, poring over forums and paranormal websites, desperate to find either a scientific explanation or someone else who had experienced the same terror. Many theories floated through the threads: psychological disturbances, optical illusions, even supernatural encounters. Each theory offered a potential explanation, but none fit perfectly, leaving me in a state of uneasy skepticism. The mirror now showed only my own reflection, mimicking my movements perfectly as it always had. Had it been a trick of the light? A hallucination brought on by sleep deprivation? I inspected the mirror, touching it, half expecting it to change again, but it remained steadfastly normal. The incident left me shaken, questioning my own sanity. I covered the mirror with a cloth, unable to face it, my mind replaying the events of the night over and over. I knew what I had seen, felt the dread, the wrongness of that smile. Eventually, I removed the mirror, unable to bear its presence in my home. Days turned into weeks and life went on, but the memory of that night lingered. Every reflective surface became a source of anxiety, each glance a potential gateway to another encounter. The reflection that didn't match was never seen again, but the fear it instilled, the questions it raised about reality and illusion, remained a haunting reminder of the night when my own face smiled back with a stranger's grin. The first note appeared innocuous enough, a slip of paper that fluttered to the ground as I opened my door to grab the morning paper. Scrawled in hasty, jagged letters, it read, "I see you." A chill traced my spine, but I dismissed it as a juvenile prank, likely the work of neighborhood kids trying to stir up a little mischief. I crumpled the paper in my hand and tossed it into the trash, letting the incident drift from my mind as the day's usual routines took over. The second note arrived the next morning under the same circumstances, but this time the message bore a more sinister weight. My name, written in the same jagged script, stood alone on the page. "Anna, I see you." The personal touch erased any doubt of a random prank. Someone was watching me, intentionally invading my sense of safety. This note I kept, a cold lump of fear settling in my stomach as I stared at my name inked on the paper. That evening, unease gnawed at my edges as dusk crept through the neighborhood. My apartment, usually a sanctuary, felt too exposed, too accessible. Every creak and whisper of the building was amplified by my growing paranoia. As the night deepened, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. Compelled by a mix of fear and the need to confront my observer, I peered through the peephole of my door throughout the night, catching glimpses of a shadowy figure lingering in the dimly lit hallway. The silhouette was indistinct, always retreating whenever I flicked on the hallway lights. Driven to action, I contacted the building management about the notes and the figure in the hallway. They promised to review security footage and increase night patrols, offering reassurances that felt hollow against my anxiety. The next note arrived despite their promises, slipped under my door while I was home, the audacity of the act sending shivers down my spine. "I'm still watching, Hannah." This time, I called the police. When the officers arrived, they took statements and collected the notes as evidence. They suggested I stay with friends or family for a few days, advice I eagerly accepted. Staying in my own home had become unbearable. Each shadow seemed to move, each noise a potential harbinger of something dire. I stayed with a close friend, grateful for the company and the respite from my besieged apartment. Despite the change of location, my nights were restless, plagued by nightmares of being watched, of shadowy figures pressing notes against windows and doors. The police investigation turned up little. The security cameras in my building malfunctioned during the hours when the notes were likely delivered. No witnesses came forward, and the figure in the hallway remained a mystery, seen only by myself in fleeting glimpses. The sense of being watched never completely left me, even with the additional security measures I put in place. Each night as I prepared for bed, the memory of those chilling notes and the shadowy figure in the hallway gnawed at the edges of my mind. The silence that now filled my apartment, once a sign of peace, felt heavy and charged with unspoken threats. I found myself double-checking the locks, reviewing camera footage for any anomaly, and jumping at the slightest sounds, signs that the psychological scars left by the ordeal were deeper than I had realized. As weeks turned into months without further incidents, my life began to slowly regain a semblance of normalcy. However, the fear that the stalker might return lingered, coloring my interactions with strangers and influencing my routines. I avoided walking home after dark and became wary of any unfamiliar faces in my building. The ordeal had transformed my home from a place of refuge into a fortress, where every precaution reminded me of the vulnerability I had felt. Returning home was a trial of nerves. I installed extra locks on my door and a camera facing the hallway, desperate for a sense of control. The notes stopped as suddenly as they had started, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions. Had the stalker lost interest, or had they never existed outside my stressed imagination? The lack of closure was almost as unsettling as the notes themselves. Months passed without incident, but the impact of those weeks lingered. I found myself jumping at unexpected touches, shying from shadows. The normal rhythms of life resumed, but a part of me remained on edge, scanning doorways and windows, forever wondering if the eyes I felt during those dark days were ever truly gone, or just waiting, watching, as they had promised. Exhaustion was my only companion as I turned the key into the lock of my front door that chilly evening. It had been one of those days at work where nothing went right, and all I wanted was to collapse into my own bed and escape the world for a few precious hours. The door swung open with its familiar creak, and I stepped inside, my mind too fogged with fatigue to immediately register the anomalies. It was the light that first caught my attention, a different shade than the warm hue I was accustomed to in my living room. Blinking in confusion, I flicked on the hallway light and paused. The space before me was transformed. Instead of my sleek, minimalist furniture, there were overstuffed sofas and ornate coffee tables draped with lace doilies. Walls that I had adorned with abstract art were now covered with family portraits, smiling faces of people I had never seen before. My heart began to race, confusion giving way to a creeping sense of dread. I thought perhaps I had mistakenly entered a neighbour's house, but a quick glance at the familiar scratch on the doorframe, a memento from when I moved a too large couch, confirmed I was where I intended to be. This was my house, yet it wasn't. The realization sent a cold shiver down my spine. I moved cautiously through the house, each room offering more evidence of a life I did not recognize. In the kitchen, children's drawings were attached to the fridge with magnets, and there was a schedule of school events pinned next to a grocery list. None of it made sense. My home, my sanctuary, had been replaced by someone else's without a trace of my own existence. Panicked, I pulled out my phone to call a friend, needing to hear a familiar voice to ensure I hadn't lost my mind. As I dialed, I noticed the date on my phone, 3 years ahead of what it should have been. My breath caught in my throat. Time, it seemed, had slipped away from me. I ended the call before it could connect, afraid of what I might learn. In a daze, I retreated to the living room, sinking down onto one of the alien sofas. The family in the photographs looked happy, blissfully unaware of the intruder in their midst. I picked up a framed photo from the coffee table, studying the faces, a couple with 2 kids, a dog at their feet. They were strangers, yet here they were, occupying the space I called home. My mind raced with possibilities: time travel, amnesia, a parallel universe, each theory more improbable than the last. As I sat there, grappling with my reality, I heard the sound of a key turning in the lock. My heart stopped. I wasn't alone. The real occupants of this version of my home were returning. A man stepped through the door, stopping short when he saw me. His confusion mirrored my own. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice cautious. I stood up, the photo still in my hand, struggling to find the words to explain a situation I didn't understand myself. "We need to talk," I managed to say, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. "I think there's been some kind of mistake." The conversation that followed was surreal, as I tried to explain my presence in what clearly was no longer my house. The man listened, bewildered, before sharing his own story of moving in a few years ago, of finding a place that felt instantly like home. The discussion yielded no answers, only deepened the mystery. Eventually, I left the house that was supposed to be mine but wasn't. The night air felt both cool and comforting as I stepped outside, the familiar neighborhood now alien under the starlit sky. I walked without direction, my mind reeling, trying to piece together the fragments of a reality that no longer made sense. In the days that followed, I sought answers that never came. The boundary between what was real and what was possible had blurred, leaving me adrift in a world that was both familiar and utterly strange. The wrong house, the wrong life, the wrong reality, all converged into a singular, unsettling truth. Home was no longer a place I could find on a map, but a memory fading fast into the fabric of another universe. Living in a densely packed neighborhood often means getting used to the lack of privacy, with windows often facing directly into someone else's home. For years, this proximity never bothered me. It was simply part of city living. However, everything changed when I started noticing a figure in the window of the house directly across the street from mine. Every night, as I prepared for bed, I would casually glance out my window, a habit formed from years of living in this same apartment. But about a month ago, my casual glances met with a chilling new reality. There stood a figure, motionless, in the window across the street. The figure was always there, standing in dim light, its features obscured, but unmistakably facing towards me. This nightly vigil became an unsettling part of my routine. Despite closing my curtains, the knowledge of its presence lingered in the back of my mind, a constant source of anxiety. The figure never moved, never showed any signs of life other than its unrelenting gaze fixed in my direction. I discussed it with friends, who suggested it might just be a mannequin or some kind of odd decoration. Trying to accept this explanation didn't ease my discomfort, though. It felt too intentional, too focused. My sleep began to suffer, with visions of the figure haunting my dreams. Then, one night, the routine changed. I approached my window with the usual trepidation, ready to force myself to face the figure, only to find the window across the street empty. No figure stood in the dimly lit room. The absence should have been a relief, yet it filled me with an even greater unease, a sense that something was about to happen. My instincts told me to stay away from my own window, to hide. But curiosity and months of pent-up anxiety got the better of me, and I found myself staring across the street, searching for any sign of the figure. It was then that I heard it, a soft, deliberate knock at my front door. The sound echoed through the silent apartment, stark and startling. My heart raced as I debated whether to answer. With a deep breath, I approached the door, peephole darkened by the night. Another knock, more insistent this time, urged me forward. Tentatively, I opened the door a crack, the safety chain still in place. There, standing in the dimly lit hallway of my apartment building, was the figure. Up close, it was even more disturbing. The figure was shrouded in dark clothes, its face barely visible, but clearly human, its eyes reflecting a glint of something unreadable but intense. "Can I help you?" My voice barely rose above a whisper, each word trembling with fear. "You've been watching," the figure stated, not a question, but an accusation, its voice unsettlingly calm. "I thought you were watching me," I stammered, confusion and fear mingling in my chest. The figure paused then. In a low, almost sad tone, it replied, "It was you, always you." With those cryptic words, the figure turned and slowly walked away, disappearing down the hallway, leaving me to grapple with the ambiguity of the encounter. Shutting the door, I leaned against it, trying to process the brief interaction. Questions swirled in my mind with no answers in sight. The following days, the window across the street remained vacant, the figure never reappearing, its identity and purpose as mysterious as the unsettling visits. The incident left a lingering impact, reshaping my sense of security and privacy. Even now, I catch myself glancing nervously across the street, half expecting to see the figure return, and occasionally I wonder about the nature of our mutual surveillance. Was it a misunderstanding, a projection of my own fears, or something more profound? The mystery remains, a silent testament to the complexities of human interaction, even from a distance. Hello everyone, I am the storyteller, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The smell hit me first, a sickly sweet odour that clung to the back of my throat and made my stomach churn. I stood frozen in Mrs. Davis's entryway, my hand still on the doorknob, as my mind raced to make sense of what my nose was telling me. This wasn't the musty scent of an abandoned house, or the stale air of a shut-in's home. This was something else entirely, something wrong. I'd known Mrs. Davis for years. She was the kind of neighbour who'd bring you chicken soup when you were sick and water your plants while you were on vacation. But lately, something had been off. Her usually immaculate lawn was overgrown, her mail piling up in the box. It had been weeks since anyone had seen her, and concern had finally outweighed my reluctance to intrude. "Mrs. Davis." I called out, my voice sounding small and muffled in the silent house. No response. I took a tentative step forward, the floorboard creaking beneath my weight. The house was dark, heavy curtains drawn against the afternoon sun. I fumbled for the light switch, blinking as harsh fluorescent light flooded the room. Everything looked normal at first glance. The same floral couch, the same doilies on the coffee table. But as my eyes adjusted, I noticed small discrepancies, a thin layer of dust on every surface, a half-empty glass of water on the side table, a film forming on its surface. "Mrs. Davis, are you home? It's Sarah from next door. I just wanted to check on you." Still nothing. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. I moved deeper into the house, unease growing with each step. The kitchen was a mess, so unlike the meticulously clean space I remembered. Dirty dishes filled the sink, and a half-eaten meal sat congealing on the table. The refrigerator hummed loudly, and when I opened it, I recoiled at the smell of spoiled food. Something was very wrong here. I pulled out my phone, ready to call the police, when a sound from upstairs made me freeze, a soft thud, like something heavy being moved. "Hello," I called out, my heart racing. "Is someone up there?" No answer, but I could have sworn I heard the creak of a floorboard. Mrs. Davis lived alone. There shouldn't be anyone else in the house. I should have left then, should have run out the front door and called for help. But worry for Mrs. Davis overrode my common sense. What if she had fallen and couldn't call for help? What if she was up there, alone and scared? The stairs loomed before me, a dark maw leading to the unknown. Each step felt like an eternity, the old wood groaning under my feet. The smell grew stronger as I ascended, and I had to fight the urge to gag. At the top of the stairs, I paused, 4 doors lined the hallway, all closed. Which one should I check first? A soft scratching sound came from behind the door at the far end, Mrs. Davis's bedroom, if I remembered correctly. I approached slowly, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob. "Mrs. Davis," I whispered, pressing my ear against the wood. The scratching stopped abruptly. For a moment, there was only silence, then a low guttural sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't Mrs. Davis. It wasn't human at all. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. The doorknob began to turn slowly, and panic seized me. I turned to run, but my foot caught on the rug. I went down hard, my knees slamming against the hardwood floor. The door creaked open behind me. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the pain shooting through my leg. I had to get out of here, had to get help. I half ran, half fell down the stairs, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I could hear heavy footsteps above me, following at a leisurely pace. They knew I had nowhere to go,